It began in whispers, a knock at midnight, a car idling in the street, footsteps on the stairs. No one ever heard the screams. In the heart of Nazi Germany, fear was not just an emotion, it was a weapon, crafted and perfected by the most dreaded organization of the Third Reich, the Gestapo. Officially, it was the Geheime Staatspolizei, the secret state police, but to millions, it was simply the shadow that haunted every thought, every conversation, every dream. It needed no armies, no uniforms in the streets, no open displays of terror to command obedience. Its power lay in silence, in the belief that it could see everything, know everything, and strike anywhere. The Gestapo's methods were the machinery of fear itself, the blueprint for a state that ruled not by force alone, but by the destruction of trust, truth, and human will. This is the story of how a nation was broken not just by war, but by the terror of its own conscience. The Gestapo was born in 1933, in the first months after Hitler's rise to power. Germany still reeling from the scars of the First World War and the collapse of democracy had fallen under the spell of a new order, one promising stability, unity, and rebirth. But behind the rhetoric of renewal stood a single goal: total control. In Prussia, Hermann Goering created the Gestapo to crush political opposition. Communists, socialists, trade unionists, anyone who dared to speak against the regime. When Heinrich Himmler and the SS took command in 1934, the Gestapo expanded from a regional police force into a national instrument of terror. Within a few years, it became the eyes and ears of the Nazi state, invisible, omnipresent, and untouchable. It answered to no court, no law, no morality. Its authority was absolute. The genius of the Gestapo's power lay not in its size. It was, in truth, surprisingly small, but in its reach. The secret was fear, fear weaponized so effectively that ordinary citizens became instruments of their own oppression. Neighbors informed on neighbors, co-workers on co-workers, children on their parents. The Gestapo didn't need to listen to every conversation. It needed only the suspicion that it might. People learned to censor themselves, to lower their voices, to look over their shoulders before speaking. Germany became a nation of whispers, where even silence could be dangerous. When the Gestapo came for you, it was sudden, absolute, and final. There were no warrants, no trials, no warnings. You were taken in the middle of the night, questioned in rooms where the lights never dimmed, and confronted by men who already knew the answers to their questions. The methods of interrogation were precise and calculated, designed not only to extract confessions, but to destroy the mind's resistance. Prisoners were deprived of sleep, subjected to endless questioning, beaten, humiliated, and broken. Some endured the cold efficiency of psychological torture, isolation, threats to family, false hope followed by despair. Others faced physical torment, whips, fists, electric shocks, and the infamous enhanced methods that would later inspire the darkest practices of regimes to come. The goal was not truth. The goal was submission, to make the prisoner confess, not because they were guilty, but because the state demanded it. Fear, once learned, became self-sustaining. The Gestapo didn't just punish resistance, it created compliance. Its prisons overflowed not only with political enemies, but with anyone who fell afoul of Nazi ideology: Jews, priests, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and anyone suspected of defeatism. Inside the labyrinth of cells and interrogation chambers, individuality ceased to exist. The human spirit was stripped bare, until even memory itself became unreliable. Prisoners learned that the Gestapo's cruelty was not chaotic. It was methodical, bureaucratic, industrial. Each confession, each name, each address was recorded and filed, feeding a machine that operated with chilling precision. Beyond the interrogation rooms, the Gestapo's reach extended into every corner of occupied Europe. In Poland, France, and the Netherlands, its agents hunted resistance networks, infiltrated partisan movements, and carried out mass arrests. In coordination with the SS and the SD, it organized deportations to concentration and extermination camps, turning occupied cities into traps of invisible threads. In Warsaw, Amsterdam, and Paris, the same pattern repeated: betrayal, arrest, interrogation, disappearance. The Gestapo was not an army, it was a virus, infecting entire societies with paranoia and despair. What made the Gestapo truly terrifying was not only what it did, but what it made others do. Ordinary men, civil servants, policemen, clerks, became collaborators in a system of terror that justified itself through obedience. Its victims, too, became instruments, forced to betray friends and family in exchange for survival. It was a system designed not just to kill, but to corrupt. It dissolved the boundaries between guilt and innocence until every man was afraid not only of being caught, but of being believed. By the end of the war, as the Reich collapsed, many Gestapo officers fled, destroyed records, or tried to blend into civilian life. At the Nuremberg trials, their crimes were laid bare: the torture, the disappearances, the role in the Holocaust. The world looked into the face of a system that had turned law into lawlessness and fear into faith. The Gestapo was declared a criminal organization, not merely for its deeds, but for what it represented: the death of humanity under the guise of order. Yet its shadow did not vanish. The methods it perfected, surveillance, coercion, psychological pressure, would echo through the decades, in the secret police of Cold War regimes and beyond. The legacy of the Gestapo is not confined to history. It is a warning. Its power was not in its guns or prisons, but in its mastery of the human mind, the knowledge that terror does not need to be constant when the memory of it is. Tonight, we descend into that world of darkness, into the cells, the files, and the whispered terror that silenced a nation. This is the entire history of the Gestapo's methods: interrogation, fear, and the machinery of control that turned millions into prisoners long before a single door was locked. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you tonight? It began in stillness, as many of history's storms do, beneath the winter breath of Berlin in 1933, where frost veiled the cobblestones and the air felt brittle with expectation. The city was weary from promises and parades, from flags that waved too often, and words that spoke too loudly. Yet beneath the noise there was something else, a quiet rearranging of life's ordinary rhythm. The cafes still opened, the trams still ran, but every conversation carried the faint tremor of watching ears. In that hush, something unseen was forming, not in the streets, but in the files and offices where power often hides. It had a plain name that betrayed no menace: the Geheime Staatspolizei, the secret state police. No trumpet announced its birth, no army marked its rise. It came softly, with ink and paper. It promised safety, order, and peace in uncertain times, but what it truly offered was something far more intimate, a new kind of fear, one that lived quietly in the space between words. Thus history's most silent institution was born from the whisper of reassurance. The first men who entered its halls were not demons in disguise, but civil servants in wool coats, men who once believed that law meant justice and structure meant safety. They filled out forms, recorded statements, and convinced themselves they were guarding the nation against chaos. Yet slowly, the rules they served began to change shape. The law no longer defended the people. It began to defend the state from the people. In this shift, something cold and precise replaced conscience, and obedience became the highest virtue. They did not notice at first, for the work felt ordinary, even noble. A man could file a report, sign his name, and return home believing he had done his duty. But within those signatures, invisible destinies were sealed, lives turned quietly toward disappearance, and from those tidy desks, fear began to move outward, unseen and unstoppable, into the streets beyond. The citizens of Berlin carried on as if life remained familiar, yet a subtle change tinged their daily routines. People spoke more softly in cafes, hesitated before finishing their thoughts, and began to measure each word like currency. Neighbors greeted one another with warmth that concealed calculation. No one could be certain who listened, who reported, who remained loyal. The old jokes vanished first, then the laughter, then the ability to speak without thinking twice. Parents told children to be cautious, to repeat nothing overheard at home. Even the sound of footsteps in the stairwell after dark drew a pulse of unease. The knock on a door, once a simple human sound, became a question, a possibility, a threat. And slowly silence itself became the safest language. There were no uniforms to announce power, no parades to display it. The men of this new police wore ordinary clothes, spoke softly, and smiled politely as they asked their questions. They appeared not as tormentors, but as administrators, as though truth itself were being balanced on ledgers and files. Those who encountered them often left confused, unsure whether they had been accused or merely consulted. It was this uncertainty that made the institution powerful, this delicate blending of law and fear. Violence was not yet needed. Dread did the work far more efficiently. People began to live as though under constant observation, though few ever saw the watchers. The Gestapo did not need to strike often. It needed only to exist in the imagination, and in that imagination it grew vast, a shadow larger than any man built entirely of doubt. By the end of that year, the machinery of suspicion had taken form without anyone truly noticing. Offices multiplied, records expanded, and conversations grew shorter. Letters carried less warmth, phone calls ended faster, and glances between friends lasted a heartbeat too long. The new Germany spoke of unity and purpose, but what it practiced was separation and control. Fear had become invisible, efficient, self-sustaining. It did not shout, it whispered, and people learned to whisper back. Even those with nothing to hide rehearsed answers in their sleep, for innocence offered no protection against attention. A nation that once prided itself on intellect and discipline now found comfort in silence, and beneath that silence, the rhythm of obedience began to hum like a distant machine. In government buildings, officials congratulated themselves on their orderliness, their precision, their calm. They believed they were restoring faith in authority, cleansing the chaos of democracy. In their files were names, addresses, and quiet condemnations written in the language of bureaucracy. There was nothing loud or bloody about this control. It was clean, logical, efficient. The reports described not crimes but tendencies, not actions but attitudes. And in that abstraction, humanity disappeared, reduced to patterns and probabilities. Power became mathematical, compassion unnecessary. The Gestapo had learned that fear could be documented, that human behavior could be catalogued like inventory. What began as administration had become domination, yet it still felt respectable, and through that respectability, its reach extended further than any weapon ever could. Those who lived beneath its gaze remember the silence most of all. The silence between words, between knocks, between glances. They recall how the air itself seemed to hold its breath. People grew skilled at pretending not to know, not to see, not to hear. A misplaced question could end a friendship. A careless opinion could summon attention. Fear was no longer an emotion, but an atmosphere, woven into the scent of coffee and the sound of distant trains. Even laughter, when it came, felt fragile, like glass about to shatter. Children grew up understanding secrets before they understood trust. The city's heart still beat, but it beat in rhythm with caution. And within that rhythm, life continued, half awake and half afraid, beneath an ever-listening sky. By winter's end, the transformation was complete. Though no one could name it, the Gestapo had woven itself into the private fabric of thought, and people had adjusted quietly, inevitably. They no longer asked who was taken or why, or when. They accepted uncertainty as the new shape of peace. Berlin moved as always. The trams clattered, the markets bustled, the river flowed, but the soul of the city had changed its sound. Trust had thinned, replaced by the careful neutrality of survival. It was a peace built not on freedom, but on restraint, not on safety, but on surrender. And through the city's frozen air drifted the faint knowledge that power had become invisible. Somewhere, a door closed softly, and another file was opened, and in that soundless gesture, history took another quiet step toward darkness. In the quiet offices of the Reich, power wore the face of paperwork. There was no shouting, no frenzy, only the soft shuffling of folders and the whisper of fountain pens drawing black lines across white sheets. Each desk became a small engine of control, where ordinary clerks sat beneath portraits of authority, transcribing suspicion into permanence. They believed they were serving order, not fear, and that their ledgers and reports were instruments of peace. Yet with every entry, every notation, another invisible thread was woven into the fabric of obedience. The Gestapo understood that terror could live in margins and footnotes, where a single phrase could decide the worth of a life. Bureaucracy was its mask, calm, exact, and clean, untouched by the noise of its consequences. Men with tidy handwriting became the unseen architects of submission. Their offices smelled of paper, dust, and polish, as if neatness itself could absolve them, and beneath the soft rhythm of their work, history began to lose its heartbeat. The true strength of the Gestapo did not lie in the number of its agents, but in the illusion of omnipresence. Its records created. A file could travel faster than a whisper, binding people together in suspicion without them ever meeting. Every form held the power to define someone's loyalty, to measure their silence, to freeze their name in a drawer that might never again be opened. Reports multiplied until the air itself seemed thick with paper, and each page reflected the cold precision of control. Even the most innocent citizen found themselves recorded, a line of ink noting occupation, family, habits, opinions. There was comfort at first in being catalogued. It felt organized, safe, official. But soon that comfort curdled into unease, for no one could know what each file might contain, or who might be reading it. A careless word could become an entry, a forgotten friendship could become a mark of danger, and in that quiet uncertainty, the ordinary became perilous. The bureaucrats were craftsmen of language. They learned to shape accusation through the softness of vocabulary, to replace cruelty with formality, phrases like preventive custody, protective detention, and further questioning turned violence into administration. Their sentences were balanced, their tone impersonal, their logic flawless. Behind such words the moral weight of action dissolved, leaving only order and completion. They signed each page with the steady calm of duty fulfilled, believing that the act of writing could separate them from the act of harm. They did not need to see the faces behind the names. The names themselves were enough. A signature replaced the sound of conscience, a seal replaced the breath of compassion, and thus language became the gentlest accomplice to fear. Everywhere the same rhythm repeated. A whisper became a report became a record became a verdict. It was not law in the traditional sense. It was a machinery of trust, misplaced and power automated. Offices filled with steel cabinets that groaned under the weight of identity, of speculation, of lives translated into lines. The men who tended these archives took pride in their precision. They measured their worth by the neatness of their work. The Gestapo did not need an army to control the streets when it possessed such perfect order within its walls. Files could decide futures more efficiently than bullets, and a well-written report could erase a person more cleanly than a weapon. In the stillness of bureaucracy, fear found its purest form, invisible, systematic, endless. Even those who served within it felt its chill, for a misplaced document could just as easily bear their own name, and the weight of paper grew heavier than any chain. To the outsider, these offices might have looked harmless. Tidy desks, organized folders, clocks that ticked with steady devotion. Yet this calmness was the true disguise of horror, for it made cruelty seem reasonable, almost benevolent. The Gestapo's power thrived not in chaos but in balance, in the slow precision of process. No one questioned the morality of ink or stamps. They were tools, not weapons. And yet within those instruments lay the quiet undoing of thousands. Fear did not require shouting or blood to survive. It only needed to be written down, verified, and filed away. The officials drank their coffee, adjusted their spectacles, and continued to write. Their rooms smelled of tobacco and paper glue, and outside their windows the city moved unaware. In this contrast between calm order and human absence, the soul of totalitarianism found its truest expression. And from this piece of paper, the world of shadows continued to grow. Ordinary people, too, became participants in this system, often without realizing it. A neighbor's letter, a worker's complaint, a shopkeeper's observation, each act of speaking was transformed into written evidence. The Gestapo depended upon the smallest details, gathering fragments until they resembled truth. In a society where loyalty was measured by silence, even honesty became suspect. Those who refused to report seemed indifferent to the nation's safety, while those who did were praised for vigilance. Gradually, the act of writing itself became a performance of devotion, a ritual of belonging. Every pen stroke was a declaration that one was watching, one was worthy, one was safe. But safety was an illusion, for the watchers were also being watched, their words destined to rest beside the words they had written about others. And so the chain of fear became endless, self-sustaining, fed by the comfort of participation. At the heart of this system was a terrible simplicity, that fear could be maintained by routine. The repetition of daily tasks, the comfort of familiar work, disguised the moral corrosion beneath it. Each day began with sorting, ended with filing, and in between came the steady rhythm of control, disguised as clerical efficiency. The Gestapo did not invent this rhythm. It inherited it from the ancient faith, in order that had shaped German administration for centuries. It merely turned that faith inward, transforming obedience into a means of domination. What had once been virtue became instrument. What had once been diligence became submission. And in this inversion, the nation found itself trapped in its own reflection, precise, obedient, and hollow. Those who lived within this structure could not hear the echo it produced, but it vibrated through every action, and beneath that vibration history waited, quietly, for its reckoning. In time, the sheer volume of paperwork became its own monument. The Gestapo's archives grew into vast, breathing organisms of documentation, endless corridors of memory and control. Every name inscribed within them carried the faint hum of a life reduced to data. Even now, decades later, historians still open these files and find within them the fragile traces of fear. They reveal not chaos, but order, and in that order lies the most haunting truth of all. Tyranny need not shout to rule. It can whisper through the sound of turning pages. Those who worked in those rooms did not see themselves as villains, yet their calm precision built the skeleton of oppression. And as they closed each file, the city outside carried on, unaware that its reflection was being drawn in ink. So it was that the paper shadows lengthened, spreading across Europe with quiet inevitability. And through those shadows, the next chapter of fear began to take shape. The power of the Gestapo did not live in its offices or its archives alone. It lived in the human ear. Fear had spread so deeply into daily life that it began to speak through ordinary mouths, soft and familiar. The state no longer needed to search for its enemies. It only needed to listen. Every street, every block, every apartment building held within it a quiet web of watchers, and the watched neighbors learned to measure each other by caution, to read meaning into gestures that once seemed innocent. A misplaced word could travel like smoke, invisible yet undeniable. Conversations became coded, laughter contained, and even the walls seemed to lean closer. The Gestapo understood this perfectly, that no organization could match the efficiency of fear shared among friends. They had discovered that the simplest form of control was trust itself, reshaped and turned inward. And through that subtle transformation, a nation began to hear itself breathing in whispers. In the beginning, most informants did not think of themselves as such. They were shopkeepers, students, clerks, and neighbors, drawn by loyalty, by fear, or by the quiet pressure to belong. Some offered names to prove devotion. Others did so to survive a suspicion they could not escape. The Gestapo rarely forced them. It only listened patiently, as confessions found their way unbidden to the surface. To be seen as silent was to invite doubt, and so people spoke, cautiously but deliberately, as if their words could buy a kind of safety. Reports arrived by mail, unsigned or carefully phrased, filled with details that might have seemed trivial. A comment overheard, a visitor noticed, a book borrowed. From these fragments, entire lives were reconstructed with mechanical precision. It was not malice that built the network, but habit, the habit of fear dressed as responsibility. And soon every word carried an aftertaste of danger. Beneath the hum of ordinary life, the rhythm of suspicion began to throb softly, like a second heartbeat beneath the first. The Gestapo's brilliance was in its restraint. It did not flood the streets with soldiers or surround homes with uniforms. It allowed fear to do that work on its behalf. The mere idea of its reach was more effective than any physical presence could be. People began to monitor themselves long before anyone else did. Mothers corrected their children's tone when speaking of politics. Friends tested each other's loyalty through silence, and workplaces grew tense with the weight of unspoken awareness. It was not the knock on the door that frightened them most, but the thought of who might have whispered it into existence. The organization had no need for omniscience. It required only that everyone believed it was listening. In this way, power multiplied invisibly, carried by those who never intended to serve it, and in their hearts a strange paradox bloomed, that to survive one must participate in the very thing that endangered them. In this delicate web, even friendship became a form of danger. The Gestapo's files reveal how many reports began with words like "regret to inform" or "I wish only to protect." Such phrases masked betrayal behind concern, turning morality into a tool of control. Those who denounced others often convinced themselves they were helping to maintain order or protect their community. Fear blurred the line between duty and guilt until both became indistinguishable. No one could be sure who had spoken, and that uncertainty eroded the intimacy that once held society together. A man could be betrayed by someone who had shared his bread the night before. A woman could be reported by a neighbor she had comforted through illness. And so, the Gestapo did not need to divide the people. It only needed to let fear do what fear always does, make isolation feel like safety. Beneath that illusion, trust dissolved into dust. Some historians later tried to count the informants, to measure how wide the web truly stretched. But such counting is impossible, for many of the most effective participants never saw themselves as spies. They were simply cautious souls who passed along a rumor, mentioned a name, or nodded at the wrong moment. The Gestapo's strength lay not in numbers but in psychology, in understanding how the human mind clings to belonging. Once the belief took hold that silence could be dangerous, speech became both weapon and shield. Each word carried a pulse of calculation, to speak or not to speak, to hide or to reveal. And through that calculation, the mind itself became a prison. In this prison, no walls were needed, for everyone had already learned to guard themselves, and the quiet spread endlessly, like mist filling every crevice of thought. In the villages, the same pattern emerged in softer tones. Farmers reported travelers they did not recognize. Teachers listed families who failed to attend rallies, and priests adjusted their sermons to sound more loyal. The sound of confession became the rhythm of control, one voice unburdening itself to another, always with the expectation of safety in return. Some believed they were preserving their communities from chaos. Others simply wished to survive. And still, the Gestapo's files grew thicker, its knowledge expanding without effort. It was as though the nation had turned its gaze upon itself, transfixed by its own reflection. People began to vanish not through arrest alone but through erasure, the quiet removal of trust from daily life. And in the spaces where trust had lived, suspicion took root like ivy on an abandoned wall. The ordinary landscape of life became a maze of invisible threads, binding everyone together and apart at once. There was no single day when the system became complete. It solidified gradually through repetition, through whispers that felt harmless until they became a storm. The Gestapo had created a structure so subtle that even those within it could not always see its shape. Power had dissolved into the atmosphere, as natural and unremarkable as air. Each person breathed it, spoke it, and carried it onward without thinking. And though the files were kept in drawers, the real archive existed in the mind, in the memories of those who learned to measure their words. It was an empire built not of soldiers but of sentences, not of walls but of listening. And once built, it required no maintenance, for it was sustained by the people themselves. Beneath the surface calm of the streets, the country had become an echo chamber where fear answered itself forever. Those who remember that time speak of the silence more than the sound, the silence that followed every question, the pause before every response. It was in those pauses that power lived, invisible but absolute. Even today, the thought of that silence carries a faint chill, as if the air itself had learned to remember. The Gestapo's reach was never truly measured in offices or files, but in the change it caused within the human voice. It taught people to edit themselves, to smooth away the edges of truth until only safety remained. And in that safety, something essential was lost: the ability to trust without calculation. When fear becomes language, language itself becomes dangerous. In that transformation lay the Gestapo's truest victory, one more enduring than any law or weapon. And from that victory, the story of control flowed forward, quiet as breath, into the next hour of history. There was a room that seemed to exist outside of time, small, still, and without windows. Its air was cool and dry, carrying the faint trace of ink, leather, and human breath. The furniture was simple: a table, 2 chairs, a lamp that burned with the steadiness of indifference. To step into that room was to step into a world where sound itself hesitated, as if afraid to echo. The walls did not threaten, they merely listened, patient and unyielding. Those who entered were not greeted with anger or noise, but with stillness. And in that stillness began the unraveling. For the Gestapo understood that the mind does not break with blows alone. It crumbles first under silence. The longer one waited for the next word, the more unbearable the quiet became. And when fear takes the shape of silence, resistance begins to feel like noise. Thus began the choreography of control, performed beneath the soft hum of a motionless lamp. The interrogators who worked in these rooms were not caricatures of cruelty. Many were calm, polite, and precise, men who believed that order could be found in the careful dismantling of certainty. Their goal was not merely to extract confession, but to reorder the self, to teach the mind that truth was a fluid thing, that memory could bend without breaking. They understood patience as power. Sometimes they spoke very little, asking only that the subject think carefully or recall again. Every repetition chipped away at confidence. Every pause reminded the listener of who controlled the rhythm. The air between questions grew heavy, like water filling a confined space. Time lost its meaning, and with it went the fragile architecture of defiance. By the end, the silence itself became the interrogator, whispering through absence what words could not say. And always beyond the door, another clock ticked softly, marking a world that continued without them. Inside that windowless room, fear learned to disguise itself as reason. The interrogator might offer kindness, a glass of water, a chair adjusted for comfort, a voice that never rose. The contrast between courtesy and captivity created its own disorientation. Gratitude began to mingle with dread until neither could be separated. The subject, longing for the predictability of cruelty, found instead the unbearable calm of civility. Questions were asked not as accusations, but as invitations, each one pulling memory into sharper focus until it no longer felt like one's own. The mind, caught between gratitude and guilt, began to surrender its edges. To resist meant prolonging the uncertainty. To speak meant returning to clarity, however painful. And so many spoke, not because they were broken, but because silence had become too vast to bear. Outside, the air felt different, as though freedom itself had thinned. There were few marks left by these encounters, for the Gestapo valued cleanliness, both physical and psychological. Pain was effective, but silence was more elegant. It required no witnesses, no signatures, no repairs. The interrogator merely needed to ask the same question in slightly different tones until truth lost its shape. A confession was not demanded, it was guided, coaxed and shaped into being. In the stillness, the human need to fill silence did the rest. Every pause became a mirror, and in it, the subject saw the faint reflection of guilt, whether real or imagined. It was this reflection the Gestapo sought, for it was easier to control a mind that doubted itself. In such a space the body remained untouched, but the self quietly dissolved, and as the door opened again, the corridor outside felt brighter than it truly was, a cruel trick of the eyes returning from the dark. Historians later noted how few Gestapo interrogations relied on overt violence. Most depended instead on fatigue, repetition, and uncertainty. The art of making time itself complicit. Sleep deprivation, long pauses, and changes in tone became instruments as precise as any weapon. They discovered that when a person's sense of duration collapsed, their moral compass faltered as well. Questions seemed endless, answers uncertain, and memory unreliable. Truth became whatever stopped the clock. The interrogator would smile faintly, as though reassuring a friend. While recording each hesitation, the subject would begin to accept that reality itself had become negotiable, and when they finally confessed, it was often not to the crime, but to the silence, to make it stop echoing in their head. Beyond those walls, the world seemed almost merciful in its noise. This mastery of silence was not accidental. It had been studied, refined, and shared across offices like an art form. Manuals circulated quietly, teaching officers how to listen, how to pause, how to let fear ferment in the quiet spaces between words. There was an elegance in their cruelty, a bureaucratic efficiency that disguised horror behind method. Interrogators learned to mirror emotion, to offer understanding, to become reflections rather than threats. The subject, seeing empathy, mistook it for safety, not realizing it was part of the design. And through this illusion, confessions came easily, willingly, and often falsely. The Gestapo did not need to shout because it had already taught its victims to whisper. In such stillness, truth no longer mattered, only control remained, and in that control, silence became the language of power. Those who survived such rooms spoke later of how sound returned differently. The noise of footsteps, the creak of doors, even birdsong felt foreign after so much stillness. The world outside seemed too alive, too unrestrained, and the self felt thinner for having been kept in silence. They carried that quiet with them, like a shadow that lingered behind each thought. Some never spoke of it, fearing that to name it would give it strength again. Others tried to explain, but language could not hold the weight of emptiness they had known. It was not what was said in those rooms that haunted them, but what was left unsaid. The memory of a question half asked, of a silence too long, became the measure of all later fears. And even decades later, when the buildings were gone, the stillness remained, hovering over the memory of what power can do when it stops speaking. In the archives, there are few traces of these rooms beyond furniture lists and maintenance records. The walls never tell their story, yet their silence still seems to echo through the paper. Each document is a faint reflection of the method, calm, efficient, almost polite. But between the lines lies something more enduring, the quiet knowledge that control need not shout to be absolute. It can whisper, it can wait, and it can convince its victims that surrender is a form of relief. The room without windows became not a place, but a metaphor, a symbol for every system that teaches obedience through anticipation. Even now, the thought of it reminds us how easily the human mind can mistake quiet for mercy. The story drifts onward, following the whisper of that silence into the next chapter, where the shadow of control deepens just beyond the threshold of sound. The moment of confession carried its own quiet gravity, as if the room itself held its breath, while ink replaced what words alone could not convey. Pens moved deliberately across paper, scratching, pausing, and sometimes trembling in the hands of those who wrote. Each line held more than fact. It held hesitation, fear, and the unspoken desire for survival. To write was to participate in a ritual of control, where truth became pliable and morality softened into order. Officials recorded answers with calm precision, attentive to every punctuation, every flourish, as though accuracy alone could absolve them. The confessions that filled these pages were rarely violent in tone, yet they contained the subtle weight of coercion. Fear was the ink, obedience the paper, and history was quietly rewritten in the silent folds of bureaucracy. Even the most reluctant signature could reshape a life with a gentleness that belied its power, and in that gentleness terror found a civilized mask. Writing became the bridge between thought and authority, a rhythm as soft as the whisper of pages turning. The Gestapo had learnt that words could be more potent than any shout, that a declaration made willingly could bind the mind as firmly as chains. The subjects often paused, considering each phrase as though consulting a distant conscience that had already been silenced. Their penmanship reflected hesitation, surrender, or compliance, all recorded without commentary, yet each stroke spoke volumes. The ink, dark and deliberate, flowed with an invisible tension, holding the echoes of uncertainty and the pulse of dread. The clerks who copied, filed, and verified these documents approached their work with a detached meticulousness. They measured letters, smoothed edges, and arranged pages with calm devotion. In the act of writing, the human experience was abstracted into shapes and lines, and as the final period was placed, a fragile silence followed, carrying the weight of truth transformed into record. Those who read the pages afterward sensed a strange order in the chaos of emotion contained within them. Names aligned with confessions, dates marked the rhythm of questioning, and the narrative of compliance stretched across the margins. The stories that emerged were as much about the writer as about what was written. Hesitation left its trace in loops and slants, pauses and ink blots, and even the quietest hand betrayed its inner conflict. In some cases, what was true and what was feared became indistinguishable, blended into lines that might convince both reader and writer alike. The Gestapo depended upon this blending, knowing that fear could make a voluntary act feel inevitable. The pen became both weapon and instrument, as ink silently carried authority into the minds of those who obeyed. The act of documentation was never neutral. It was always participation. And through these silent records, the machinery of control found its softest voice. Paper and ink offered a calm ritual that reassured both subject and recorder. For the officials, the neat rows of letters symbolized mastery, efficiency, and the maintenance of order. For the subjects, filling in forms or signing statements became a contract with certainty, however fragile, and a reprieve from the longer, emptier silence. Confession ceased to be a confrontation. It became an exchange, a pattern repeated and predictable. Even the softest scratch of a pen carried weight, marking time and compliance with a quiet inevitability. The pages accumulated, each one echoing the last, creating a forest of text that recorded fear as faithfully as any ledger. Authority did not need to shout. It only needed witnesses in the form of paper, and every hand that wrote became a witness itself. The gentle rhythm of writing replaced the abruptness of noise, and in that rhythm fear became method, and method became habit. There was artistry in this quiet process, a precision in every step that masked the gravity beneath. Officials cultivated a calm patience, waiting as sentences were composed, listening to the almost imperceptible shifts of posture and pen. They observed the subtle signs of surrender, recording them with careful neutrality, as though cataloguing birds or clouds. Each confession was both a document and a lesson, demonstrating how control could be exercised without sound or spectacle. Even the choice of words carried weight. The careful selection of verbs and adjectives shaped perception and reality alike. The page absorbed everything: anxiety, hesitation, compliance, and at times the faint glimmer of resistance. Writing became a mirror, reflecting inner turmoil while smoothing its edges into coherent order, and the quiet continued, folding each fear into the permanence of ink. Through this gentle attention, the power of observation became indistinguishable from the act of creation itself. The permanence of the record made fear tangible without needing to raise its voice. A signature could seal a future, a paragraph could define a reputation, and a single word could alter the course of memory. Officials handled these documents with careful devotion, aware that every stroke, every correction, every annotation carried the authority of the state. They understood that ink was quieter than anger, subtler than threat, yet infinitely more enduring. The subjects, in surrendering to the pen, participated willingly in their own subjugation. They learned to read between the lines, to measure the weight of punctuation, to sense the silent authority that had guided their hand, and in that measurement a soft but profound transformation took place. Reality became negotiable, and obedience became habitual. Through the sound of a pen, lives were rearranged without violence, and as the last sheets were stacked, the quiet of the room felt both heavy and complete. Even outside the offices, the rhythm of the pen carried its influence. Families and neighbors became aware of the subtle authority that paper imposed, the way a statement could echo across months or years. Bureaucracy had become both shield and instrument, smoothing fear into civilization. The soft scratching of ink on paper marked the border between memory and recorded history, shaping what could be remembered and what could be denied. People came to understand that documentation was permanent, that the state's quiet attention was unending. The act of writing, once ordinary, had become sacred and dangerous all at once. Fear and obedience were codified, and in that codification, the ordinary world was quietly altered. Even the most mundane forms, once a simple record of events, became instruments of power, and through these pages the next chapter of influence quietly unfolded, flowing from the ink to the lives it contained. The sound of a pen became a lullaby of control, soft and almost comforting to those who wielded it, and those who surrendered to it. Ink offered a rhythm predictable and serene, where chaos had once threatened. Each line was deliberate, measured, and meaningful, absorbing tension without raising it to noise. The Gestapo understood that power need not shout to persist. It only needed to leave a permanent trace. Confessions, voluntary or coaxed, became part of a living archive of obedience, carrying with them the memory of uncertainty and the weight of compliance. Every sheet, carefully filed, echoed the quiet perfection of method, and in this echo fear was domesticated. The world could move on, unaware of how profoundly its order was written and rewritten, and in the softest hours, when the ink dried and the hands rested, the hum of authority continued, subtle, steady, and unbroken. Through the accumulation of documents, history learned to speak in whispers. The paper held everything that violence might have spoken more loudly, but with gentler inevitability. Each confession became a meditation on power, compliance, and the quiet shaping of human thought. The ritual of writing, repeated over and over, revealed the Gestapo's method, that control is more lasting when it is calm, when it is orderly, when it is made to feel natural. And as the last pen was set down and the lamp's glow softened in the evening, the quiet hum of obedience carried the story forward, as softly as the turning of a page, into the waiting corridors of memory. The streets of Vienna, Warsaw, and countless other cities carried a quiet tension, almost imperceptible, that hummed beneath ordinary life. Windows were shut more tightly, voices lowered, and footsteps slowed as if the cobblestones themselves listened. Shops opened, markets bustled, and children still played, yet every interaction was measured, delicate, almost ritualistic. Residents knew that attention had multiplied beyond the visible, that even the most mundane gestures could be observed, remembered, and recorded. People spoke in whispers, practiced restraint, and learned that silence often protected more than words. Mothers cautioned children to move softly, to question nothing, to be wary of friends whose eyes lingered too long. The city's rhythm became a shared secret, an unspoken agreement between the careful and the watchful. Fear, subtle and persistent, wove itself into the pulse of daily life. Even in crowded squares, isolation could be felt, and in that isolation, the first lesson of obedience quietly unfolded. Neighbors became both anchors and threats, their proximity a source of comfort and suspicion. Conversations in cafes were measured, glances exchanged with careful neutrality, and letters composed with double attention to phrasing. The ordinary human act of sharing news or laughter was shadowed by doubt, as if words carried hidden weight. Many civilians recalled the strange energy of walking streets, where each face might conceal a listener, a recorder, or a reporter. The city's beauty, the architecture, the parks, the flowing rivers, could not dispel the invisible tension that threaded between its buildings. Life continued in cycles of work and rest, commerce and quiet reflection, yet always under the gentle pressure of expectation. People learned to notice what had never required attention before: a prolonged stare, a door left open too long, a pause too pronounced in conversation. In this attentive stillness, communities folded in upon themselves, fragile but enduring. The rhythm of daily life adjusted to the soft echo of fear, and with each passing day the city itself became a participant in its own surveillance. Even markets, once alive with spontaneous chatter, carried a new cadence of caution. Shoppers measured their words, stallholders smiled with care, and neighbors exchanged greetings in tones that masked uncertainty. Every purchase, every exchange, became a quiet test of attention and loyalty. The act of ordinary commerce took on the subtle weight of observation. People learned to navigate these invisible currents, trading freedom for security and spontaneity for predictability. Letters arrived punctually, but their contents were filtered, measured, and sometimes omitted to avoid unintended consequences. Teachers observed students with new awareness. Parents noted every comment from visitors, and the air itself seemed to hold a muted presence. Even the distant sound of a train carried a faint vibration of caution, reminding residents that life moved with unseen scrutiny. Daily existence became a gentle choreography, a careful negotiation between openness and restraint, and beneath that choreography, the soft pulse of fear continued, steady and enduring. Testimonies from those who lived through this time reveal the quiet constancy of surveillance. One woman remembered walking through Warsaw, feeling that every doorway held invisible eyes, and that the breeze carried whispers she could not trace. A man in Vienna spoke of how even friends in cafes seemed to weigh their words, as though the conversation itself could betray them. These recollections shared a common rhythm. Life had not stopped, but it had learned to move differently, more slowly, more deliberately. Each day contained ordinary joys and ordinary routines, yet over them hovered a faint awareness of control. Children grew accustomed to whispered rules, neighbors relied on half silences, and the city itself seemed to inhale cautiously before speaking. The echo of potential observation was never loud, yet it was constant, shaping even laughter and play. Civic life persisted, but it did so with care, as if the entire population had learned to inhabit both presence and absence simultaneously. And in this duality, the soul of the city quietly adapted. Even celebrations, once full of spontaneity and shared delight, were tempered by awareness. Small festivals, markets and concerts continued, but participants moved with subtle restraint, aware that joy itself could be scrutinized. People learned to smile without exaggeration, to speak without excess, to enjoy without drawing attention. The act of gathering became a negotiation between connection and caution, a balance of safety and participation. The gentle rhythm of life was punctuated by awareness of who might be listening and what that attention might mean. Some residents found comfort in this order, seeing it as protection from chaos, while others sensed its quiet weight pressing on their choices. And in the repetition of these small, cautious rituals, the culture of fear became normalized. Even the familiar streets seemed to echo with the faint hum of observation, a soundless orchestra of vigilance, and from this delicate, measured life, the city itself whispered its own lessons about caution, attention, and endurance. The architecture of these cities, with their narrow alleys, dense buildings, and interwoven streets, lent itself to observation. Balconies overlooked courtyards where conversations drifted. Windows offered fleeting glimpses of neighbors' gestures, and stairwells carried echoes that betrayed pauses or hesitation. Residents grew attentive to these subtleties, reading movements as carefully as words. The city became a living classroom in the art of discretion, teaching lessons that were quiet but profoundly felt. People adjusted routines, noting which routes were safer, which paths invited notice, and which interactions might carry hidden consequences. The ordinary experience of walking home, shopping, or attending work became infused with a soft, continuous awareness. Even the changing seasons were measured differently, as the glare of sunlight, the whisper of wind, and the falling of leaves could expose gestures or conversations to observation. Life unfolded slowly, rhythmically, like a gentle tide that both revealed and concealed, and in the ebb of each day, the quiet pulse of vigilance persisted, shaping memory as much as action. Letters, messages, and daily reports created a network that connected the city to the invisible web of control. Even when officials were far, their influence was carried along the currents of ordinary interaction. A note delivered to a friend, a remark shared in a cafe, a complaint offered to a shopkeeper, all became part of the gentle machinery of observation. Civilians internalized this awareness, moderating behavior without the need for direct presence or threat. The streets and squares reflected this adaptation, calm yet tense, ordinary yet transformed. People spoke less, moved more deliberately, and carried their private thoughts like fragile cargo. Silence became both shield and signal, a language shared without words. And through these subtle exchanges, the city itself participated in the creation of its own quiet order. From every whispered name, every careful gesture, the rhythm of surveillance extended, soft, patient, and enduring. And yet, amid this quiet, life retained a fragile beauty. Gardens grew, fountains sang, markets continued, and families still shared meals with soft laughter. The air carried scents of bread, of rain on stone, of wood smoke curling from chimneys, grounding residents in the simple pleasures of existence. Fear existed alongside life, but it did not entirely consume it. It coexisted as a gentle hum beneath daily routines. The rhythm of the city, though measured, was still the rhythm of human persistence. Citizens adapted to the soft pressures of observation, finding ways to exist fully within the constraints of caution. And in doing so they preserved dignity, memory, and small joys that remained quietly theirs. Life moved forward, measured but resilient, soft but enduring. And beneath the quiet streets and behind the closed windows, the story of cities that whispered carried onward, preparing the world for the next layer of history's unfolding. In quiet towns far from the bustle of Berlin, buildings stood in disciplined silence, their walls absorbing the rhythm of expectation. Here young men arrived, uniformed and uncertain, carrying both ambition and hesitation. They were guided into halls where the air smelled faintly of polished wood, paper, and the distant echo of order. The instructors did not shout, did not threaten. They spoke softly, deliberately, teaching that authority need not demand noise to be obeyed. Lessons were given in method, in the subtleties of perception, in the careful reading of hesitation. Recruits learned that power was measured not by physical force, but by the control of thought, by the shaping of silence, by the soft orchestration of fear. They were trained to listen, to notice, to calibrate, to understand that even the smallest pause could reveal more than words ever would. Each day was structured, precise, and quiet, reinforcing that obedience was cultivated in rhythm and habit. And as the evenings fell, the recruits carried these lessons into their minds, where they settled like gentle sediment. The curriculum was subtle, blending ideology and technique, with a slow, deliberate cadence. Recruits studied behavior, human emotion, and the nuances of conversation, not to harm, but to guide and control. The exercises were quiet, almost meditative, designed to refine awareness rather than brute strength. Students practiced patience as if it were a muscle, repetition as if it were prayer, observation as if it were breath. They learned the art of waiting, of asking questions that seemed innocuous, of listening to silences that spoke louder than words. Every correction from an instructor carried calm authority, a soft pressure that reshaped thought without resistance. They were taught that the mind could be gently directed, that fear need not scream to command obedience. And in this environment, obedience was not demanded. It was cultivated, slowly, meticulously, like a garden pruned with care. Each lesson left a faint echo, reinforcing that control could be elegant, calm, and precise. And when the day ended, the echo remained, guiding thought like a soft, persistent tide. Physical skill mattered less than the mastery of perception. Recruits practiced conversation, carefully noting the subtlest shifts in posture, tone, and expression. Each gesture, each glance was studied, catalogued, and reflected upon until observation became instinctive. Empathy was taught, not to comfort, but to illuminate, to understand and anticipate reactions before they could manifest. Lessons emphasized timing, rhythm, and subtlety, reminding each student that silence often held more authority than speech. They learned to recognize hesitation as a signal, consistency as a cue, and routine as an opportunity. Fear, they understood, could be guided with whispers, glances, and measured expectation, rather than raised voices or visible threat. The mind was the battlefield, and the tools were thought, observation, and patience. And as the hours passed, the recruits began to internalize these principles, each step a quiet transformation. By the end of each day, their understanding of power had grown, gentle yet profound, as if absorbed through the very walls themselves. Even the architecture of the training centers reinforced this discipline of perception. Narrow corridors, quiet rooms, and small courtyards shaped the rhythm of movement, teaching awareness through spatial consciousness. Students learned to navigate the space with quiet attentiveness, noting sounds, shadows, and patterns that others might overlook. The environment itself became a teacher, a guide for observing subtlety in everyday life. The gentle creak of a floorboard, the soft echo of a closing door, the faint scuff of a shoe across polished stone. All were lessons in attention. By the time recruits moved through these halls, without guidance, their awareness of environment and nuance was almost instinctual. Every gesture and step was measured, reinforcing the slow, deliberate rhythm that had been ingrained in them. In this way, training became seamless with life, blending method with experience, control with perception, and the quiet discipline of these halls extended outward, preparing the men for the city streets that awaited. History remembers these centers not for spectacle, but for their subtle shaping of minds. Manuals and reports emphasize calm instruction, repetition, and psychological insight, rather than overt violence. Recruits were molded to see order as a virtue, to measure behavior as data, to observe without drawing attention. The instructors instilled patience as the foundation of authority, and subtlety as the essence of power. They taught that a well-timed question, or a quiet pause, could yield more than any raised voice. Obedience was to be gentle but absolute, a reflection of precision rather than threat. Each trainee learned that fear could be cultivated without overt displays, and that the softest influence often had the deepest reach. And as each cohort graduated, they carried with them a skill set both invisible and enduring, leaving behind only the quiet echo of method. These graduates would go on to cities and offices, streets and homes, their training woven into the very rhythm of control. The psychological lessons were intertwined with ideology, teaching recruits not only how, but why obedience mattered. They were instructed that stability, loyalty, and vigilance were paramount, and that these virtues could be instilled with calm guidance. Ideology was never shouted, it was absorbed through repetition, discussion, and reflection. Recruits wrote reports, debated scenarios, and practiced assessment with gentle intensity, internalizing principles of authority without realizing it. Over time, they became adept at reading thought before it was spoken, understanding hesitation before it became visible, guiding outcomes without apparent interference. The training emphasized that power resides not in dominance alone, but in subtle influence and measured presence. Even the smallest decisions were exercises in observation and judgment, and the trainees learned that restraint, discipline, and quiet anticipation could accomplish more than aggression. By the end of these sessions, they were shaped into instruments of control, calm, efficient, and almost imperceptible in their influence. The instructors themselves were models of this philosophy, embodying order, patience, and subtle authority. They moved with quiet confidence, spoke with measured intonation, and responded with calm deliberation. Recruits learned from example, as much as from formal instruction, absorbing the rhythm of thought and behavior modeled for them. Corrections were soft but precise, praise was rare but deliberate, and guidance was always steady and deliberate. These men did not rely on spectacle to command attention. They relied on presence, consistency, and a careful mastery of human response. Their teaching cultivated awareness, adaptability, and endurance, shaping recruits into observers, analysts, and guides, rather than aggressors. And in the soft cadence of instruction, the trainees internalized lessons of patience, foresight, and measured influence that would follow them indefinitely. Each day ended with reflection, a quiet settling of knowledge into habit, preparing the mind for the challenges beyond the walls. By the time graduates left the school, they carried a quiet confidence and an almost imperceptible authority. They had been molded not by force, but by attention, reflection, and repetition. Their skill lay in the ability to shape outcomes without overt action, to guide without pressure, to observe without interruption. They understood the rhythm of human response, the subtle power of anticipation, and the elegance of restraint. Obedience and control were no longer external demands, but internalized practices, part of thought itself. And as they walked into the cities that whispered into offices and homes, the lessons of the School of Shadows moved with them. Each step, each glance, each word carried the quiet imprint of training, and through this invisible architecture of influence, the story of control continued to unfold softly, deliberately, and inexorably into the next chapter of history. The human mind, fragile and adaptive, became the quiet laboratory of control. The Gestapo observed not only actions but the subtle rhythms of thought, the flicker of hesitation, the way fear reshaped intention. They studied how people bent to suggestion, how compliance could be guided like a stream along a gentle slope. Early 20th century experiments in psychology, hypnosis, and social influence offered them insight into the pliability of behavior. They learned that order could be maintained not through visible force, but through anticipation, repetition, and subtle pressure. Fear, they discovered, need not be violent to be absolute. The mind itself could be conditioned to respond with obedience before command was even given. Every gesture, word, and pause became data, catalogued and applied. And through this careful study, control became both art and science, quiet yet unyielding. Recruits and agents were trained to read these cues with patience and precision. A fleeting glance, a hesitant breath, a pause too long, all spoke volumes about intention and resistance. Officers learned to respond, not with overt authority, but with calibrated influence, guiding thought through suggestion and expectation. Human behavior was understood as a rhythm, a sequence that could be anticipated and adjusted without force. Even in the absence of direct command, people adapted, adjusting themselves to the invisible hand that guided their world. The psychology of obedience became as important as the mechanics of interrogation, and so the practice of control extended beyond rooms and files into streets, workplaces, and homes, shaping action before it occurred. In this subtle shaping, authority became intimate, almost invisible. The science of compliance transformed ordinary life into a quiet, measured dance, and through this dance, the soft architecture of fear spread without sound. The Gestapo's application of these principles relied on understanding expectation as a tool. A question asked gently, repeated with small variation, could elicit more information than any raised voice. A suggestion framed as choice could lead subjects to reveal truths without realizing the guidance applied. Each interaction became an exercise in psychological nuance, a careful exploration of how minds adjust under uncertainty. They discovered that consistency, patience, and calm authority were more effective than aggression. The very presence of observation reshaped behavior, often before anyone spoke. Obedience was learned quietly, ingrained in habits, and reinforced in memory. Even small deviations were noted, corrected, and recorded for future calibration. And so the mind became both instrument and target, guided without coercion, influenced without threat. In this quiet control, the Gestapo perfected an invisible dominion. Fear itself was methodically applied, soft but persistent. It was not always a sudden shock, but a slow accumulative weight that reshaped perception. People learned to anticipate consequences before they arrived, to moderate speech and action. According to the invisible patterns of authority, suggestion became a gentle echo that accompanied daily decisions, influencing choice without awareness. Repetition, expectation, and observation combined to create a rhythm that was inescapable, subtle, and enduring. Even the simplest human acts were subtly guided by this framework, a quiet choreography of response. The mind, conditioned over time, accepted control as natural, habitual, and inevitable. And in the quiet accumulation of these small pressures, compliance became almost unconscious. The science of obedience as practiced here transformed thought itself into a field of soft influence. And through this transformation, the ordinary world became a measured, watchful place. The principles of suggestion and compliance were reinforced in every setting. Interrogation rooms, offices, homes, and streets all became laboratories for observation. Officers tested responses, recorded subtleties, and adapted methods according to individual behavior. Human attention, expectation, and memory were all measured, utilized, and gently guided. Even informal encounters became exercises in psychological application. The Gestapo's methods were subtle, elegant in their quiet precision, leaving little trace of coercion while producing profound effects. They understood that the softest pressure consistently applied could achieve what force often could not. Control, in this sense, was invisible, yet undeniable. And through these observations, they cultivated an almost clinical understanding of human obedience. Every day in the city became part of this continuous experiment in quiet authority. This knowledge was codified into training, manuals, and routines. Officers learned that fear and suggestion could be combined to create compliance that seemed voluntary. They studied human tendencies toward conformity, repetition, and acquiescence, using these patterns to guide interrogation and surveillance. Patience and timing became instruments as precise as any tool, allowing influence to grow quietly without visible imposition. Every gesture, tone, and pause was calculated to elicit maximum response with minimum force. Officers internalized these methods until they became instinctive, shaping behavior both of others and themselves. The rhythm of observation and guidance became second nature, a continuous application of subtle pressure. And in this mastery, obedience was normalized, almost as natural as breathing. Control extended beyond individual moments, embedding itself in patterns, expectations, and memory. Through careful cultivation, authority became internalized, almost invisible yet profoundly effective. Even beyond direct interaction, the science of obedience shaped entire communities. Knowledge of expectation, subtle influence, and psychological pressure allowed the Gestapo to guide behavior from afar, through rumor, routine, and suggestion. Citizens adapted unconsciously, moderating themselves according to patterns they sensed rather than commands they heard. The system relied not on confrontation, but on anticipation, creating a society where compliance preceded instruction. People moved, spoke, and acted with awareness of invisible structures, internalizing the rhythms of control. Fear was ever present, but it was quiet, insistent, and continuous, rather than abrupt or violent. Social habits, rituals, and routines carried the soft imprint of authority, reinforcing obedience in ways both subtle and enduring. And through this pervasive influence, entire cities became extensions of psychological method. Life continued under this soft guidance, orderly, predictable, and measured by invisible hands, and the quiet study of human behavior carried the story forward into deeper layers of control. Historians later recognized the meticulousness of this approach. The Gestapo's understanding of the mind allowed them to anticipate reactions, shape choices, and cultivate compliance with minimal disruption. Obedience was not simply enforced, it was taught, absorbed, and internalized. The silent rhythms of expectation, repetition, and subtle pressure became a pervasive architecture of influence. Civilians, often unaware, adapted continuously, their own decisions guided by fear and anticipation. Even small gestures became measured, routines became structured, and thought itself became a field of soft control. The mind, trained in this quiet obedience, carried the legacy of surveillance far beyond the offices and interrogation rooms. And as the days passed in the cities that whispered, the science of compliance grew ever more effective, quietly shaping behavior and perception alike. Through understanding the human psyche, control became invisible, yet absolute, guiding the story into its next unfolding chapter. Beyond ordinary hallways, behind thick wooden doors, the world contracted into a silence that was almost tangible. Those who entered carried the weight of expectation, uncertainty, folding into each breath. Inside, the air was cool, steady, and heavy with anticipation, as if the room itself awaited confession. Chairs faced one another with deliberate spacing, the table between them neutral yet insistent. Every gesture, every pause became meaningful, amplified by the quiet. The interrogator spoke softly, each word deliberate, measured, almost familiar. Silence filled the space between questions, stretching and bending time until hesitation itself became a language. The captive, aware of this rhythm, adjusted posture, tone, even thought, without realizing the extent. Small comforts, a glass of water, a chair repositioned, offered relief and subtle manipulation at once. And in this interplay, the dance of control began quietly but decisively. The methods were not violent in the immediate sense, yet they were precise and unyielding. Each question was calibrated, repeated, and framed to evoke reflection, doubt, and disclosure. Instructors of the mind had taught the officers that anticipation and uncertainty could achieve more than aggression. The interrogator listened as much as spoke, reading subtle signs of stress, hesitation, or clarity. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, making each pause feel significant. Even a faint cough, a shift in the hand, or a slow blink became a signal to be interpreted. Confession was coaxed with care, guided by rhythm rather than force, until it emerged as if voluntarily offered. The captive, navigating both fear and courtesy, became complicit in their own disclosure. And when the words finally came, they carried the weight of both reality and suggestion. Outside the room, the world moved, unaware of the quiet intensity within. Observers later reconstructed these interrogations from meticulous archives, revealing the artistry of timing. Each session followed a pattern of expectation, question, pause, soft reassurance, subtle pressure. The room itself contributed to the rhythm, walls absorbing sound, air carrying tension in measured waves. Interrogators practiced calm patience, knowing that a misstep in timing could unravel the method. Every interaction was a test in perception, as the quiet unfolding of confession depended on nuance, attention, and anticipation. The room was never empty of presence. Every silence was alive. Every glance waited. Fear was never shouted. It crept gently, insinuating itself into thought, whispering in spaces between words. The technique relied upon observation, subtle guidance, and quiet persistence. Each confession was as much a product of timing as it was of content. And in this rhythm, the captive's mind became a landscape to navigate, carefully and silently. The intimacy of these encounters was disquieting in its subtlety. The captor and captive engaged in a quiet dialogue where power was woven into each gesture, each utterance, each breath. Familiarity and authority coexisted, leaving the subject unsure whether to relax or resist. Even small gestures, like a leaning forward or the soft adjustment of a hand, carried authority without aggression. The silence between sentences grew, inviting reflection, anticipation, and ultimately compliance. Each pause became a mirror, reflecting fear, hesitation, and the faint desire to appease. Conversation became a tool, not for dialogue, but for shaping thought and guiding action. The room's stillness emphasized this tension, making every subtle movement resonate more deeply. And through this quiet intimacy, the rhythm of confession took root, steady and unbroken. Outside, the ordinary world awaited, but within time flowed according to its own measured pace. Officers relied upon observation as much as speech. A tilt of the head, the shifting of weight, the cadence of a voice all became data points, informing the next move. They understood that a question asked too soon, too late, or too abruptly could disrupt the fragile flow of disclosure. Patience became a strategy, waiting until hesitation itself prompted the revelation. Even the arrangement of the table, the spacing of chairs, and the angle of light contributed to the psychological environment. The subjects, though unaware, responded naturally to these subtle cues, revealing more than they intended. Authority was quiet but palpable, gentle but pervasive, invisible but undeniable. The act of confession became a collaboration, orchestrated with care, discipline, and attention. And as the session progressed, both officer and subject moved through a rhythm of quiet tension, expectation, and eventual release. Outside, life continued as it always had, yet inside the world had narrowed to a single measured conversation. The room held lessons that extended beyond individual encounters. Each session added to collective knowledge, informing future practice, guiding subtlety, and refining approach. Officers learned to recognize patterns of resistance, anticipate mental shifts, and calibrate response accordingly. Even minor gestures, a hand trembling, a delayed response, a change in tone, became instructive, reinforcing the art of gentle persuasion. Over time, the patterns became methodical, the rhythm predictable to the trained observer. Confession was rarely abrupt. It emerged as an inevitability, guided quietly and skillfully. The interplay of expectation, suggestion, and attention shaped the mind, often without the subject realizing the extent. Each experience was both unique and instructive, a study in rhythm, restraint, and influence. And as the room emptied, leaving only echoes of controlled silence, the lessons lingered quietly in memory and method. The archive reconstructions reveal a cadence that is both soothing and disquieting. Questions flowed, pauses lingered, Reassurance and subtle pressure interwove, and confession unfolded gradually. There was a careful balance between calm and tension, expectation and release, guidance and observation. The subject's responses were catalogued, repeated, and understood in context, as if every hesitation had a soft significance. The process relied on an almost imperceptible control of environment and timing, making compliance feel natural and inevitable. Silence was never empty, it was charged, alive and attentive, a medium through which power communicated. Fear was present but gentle, persistent but not abrupt, and through this intricate rhythm, the art of interrogation achieved a quiet intensity, shaping thought without the need for spectacle. Outside the walls, life remained ordinary, yet the imprint of method lingered, subtle, soft, and enduring. Even when sessions concluded, the residual influence persisted. Subjects carried the memory of rhythm, pause, and expectation, internalizing the patterns long after leaving the room. The quiet lessons of timing, attention, and subtle pressure extended into thought and behavior, shaping memory, perception, and decision. Officers relied upon this lingering effect, knowing that influence often continued beyond the immediate interaction. Each encounter was a study in gentle, persistent control, teaching obedience without the need for noise or spectacle. Confession became a product not of threat, but of method, subtle and deliberate. The intimacy of interaction, guided by attention and patience, left a quiet, enduring impression, and in this careful orchestration of silence, pause, and expectation, the mechanics of control were rendered both invisible and absolute. Beyond closed doors, the world seemed unchanged, yet inside the rhythm of authority had left its mark. Through the quiet intensity of these interactions, the art of influence became profound. Officers learned to shape behavior, anticipate response, and guide disclosure with soft authority. Every gesture, word, and pause was a tool in a gentle but effective system of control. The captives, navigating expectation and suggestion, contributed unknowingly to their own guidance. Each session became a study in human psychology, a rhythm of attention, and a meditation in quiet power. The room, the method, and the mind intertwined to produce an effect, subtle, precise, and enduring. And as each day ended, the archives accumulated, knowledge deepened, and the story of control continued, moving softly into the next layer of influence and method. Outside, ordinary life persisted, but behind closed doors, the quiet rhythm of authority continued its work, steady, measured, and unbroken. Time in the room seemed to stretch and bend, folding inward upon itself until every moment felt significant and delicate. The air was heavy, yet calm, carrying a quiet tension that neither rushed nor pressed, but lingered gently. In these fragile hours, memory and anticipation intertwined, threading through thought like soft currents. A single recollection could surface, carrying warmth or regret, and the mind moved between clarity and fog. The captives, though outwardly composed, felt the subtle weight of expectation pressing against them. Each breath, each pause, became a measure of endurance, a small rhythm in a larger, imperceptible pattern. The faint creak of the floor, the distant echo of a step elsewhere, the soft draft through the room, all contributed to a sense of presence and awareness. Within this quiet landscape, resistance and reflection coexisted, flickering like candlelight across thought, and as the moment stretched, the mind began to navigate a fragile boundary between persistence and yielding. Guilt surfaced softly, like a shadow stretching across the floor of memory. Actions taken long ago, words spoken, promises unkept. All carried an echo that now seemed amplified in the quiet. The mind traced these echoes carefully, measuring their weight against the faint pressure of expectation. In this delicate interplay, the line between choice and inevitability blurred. Hope, too, lingered subtly, a gentle counterpoint to apprehension. It emerged in tiny acts of recollection, in the careful alignment of thoughts, in fleeting self-reassurance. The room, still and attentive, became a space for internal negotiation, a sanctuary where the mind weighed courage against concession. Each heartbeat seemed to echo softly, a metronome marking the rhythm of internal deliberation. And through this gentle collision of memory, hope and apprehension, the fragile hour deepened, slow and deliberate. Outside, the city carried on, unaware of the silent negotiation unfolding within these walls. Every hesitation became a landscape to explore, a subtle measure of endurance. Thoughts drifted between resistance and acquiescence, shifting like soft ripples across calm water. Even the quietest reflection seemed amplified, carrying weight as if the room itself acknowledged it. The captives learned to notice their own rhythms, breath, posture, glance, and heartbeat, each offering insight into inner state. The mind traced the pathways of past choices, measuring their alignment with present circumstance. A gentle tension filled awareness, persistent yet non-intrusive, encouraging reflection without forcing it. The soft passage of time allowed insight to accumulate, quiet and cumulative, like sediment settling at the bottom of water. In this slow cadence, decisions began to crystallize, though the process remained almost invisible to external eyes. Each flicker of thought, each moment of self-assessment, contributed to the intricate dance of endurance, and as the fragile hour continued, the mind moved subtly toward understanding, if not resolution. Hope appeared in small, unexpected gestures, in the soft recognition of one's own limits and resilience. It was neither loud nor immediate, but glimmered in moments of reflection and quiet breath. The mind recognized that surrender could be temporary, that endurance held value independent of outcome. Every memory recalled, every hesitation acknowledged, added layers to understanding. Even the faintest comfort, a familiar thought, a remembered word of encouragement, a quiet personal truth, carried weight. The room, attentive in its silence, seemed to allow space for these small consolations, and as each fragment of hope surfaced, it moved like a gentle tide against the currents of apprehension. Choices, though pressured, were weighed in the soft light of self-reflection, and in this delicate equilibrium, the fragile hour revealed the human capacity to negotiate inner landscapes under subtle influence. The mind balanced between resistance and yielding, slow, soft, and observant. Memory surfaced gently, guiding thought through familiar paths and forgotten corners. Faces, voices, and distant moments threaded together, soft as smoke in the air. Each recollection carried warmth, regret, or insight, contributing to the quiet rhythm of self-assessment. Even fleeting images, moments of childhood, friendships, or distant laughter, offered anchor points in the tide of apprehension. Thoughts meandered like streams, sometimes calm, sometimes quickening, but always contained within the gentle pressure of expectation. The captives recognized these currents, tracing their contours, understanding their force, and noting their subtle influence. In doing so, they participated quietly in their own navigation, a delicate negotiation of mind and emotion. And in this interplay of memory and awareness, decisions began to take shape, soft and deliberate, almost imperceptible. Each reflection, each remembered word or gesture, contributed to the rhythm of internal choice. Through these currents, The fragile hour flowed, gentle and persistent. The room itself seemed to hold awareness, attentive yet unobtrusive. Every shift of air, every faint sound, and every subtle vibration became part of the internal landscape. The captives moved in time with these soft cues, adjusting posture, focus, and thought. The rhythm of endurance was internalized, almost like a pulse, marking each moment with awareness. Silence and suggestion coexisted, shaping thought without intrusion, guiding reflection without pressure. Each heartbeat, each inhalation, each flicker of focus became a quiet signal, marking the passage of time and intention. In this space, surrender and persistence were not forced but chosen in the slow cadence of self-awareness. The fragile hour allowed for the mind to wander, to confront, and to reconcile inattention with external expectation, and as minutes accumulated, the delicate balance between resistance and yielding became increasingly clear. In the quiet, the mind moved softly toward its own resolution. Every internal struggle carried both weight and grace, measured in small increments of attention. The conflict between instinct, memory, and expectation unfolded gently, like layers settling over time. Each hesitation and reflection shaped perception, molding choices in subtle ways. The room, receptive in its quiet, absorbed these mental contours, giving space for thought to breathe. Even fear, though present, was soft, a gentle pressure rather than abrupt intrusion. The mind recognized patterns, traced outcomes, and anticipated consequence, slowly orienting itself toward resolution. Hope and apprehension intertwined, creating a delicate balance that guided action and reflection. In this measured landscape, the human spirit was quietly tested, challenged, and observed, and through this gentle rhythm, the fragile hour became both crucible and refuge, soft yet profound. Each passing moment carried the echo of endurance and quiet understanding. As the fragile hour drew onward, clarity began to surface. Thoughts once tangled with doubt and apprehension, organized into gentle pathways of awareness. Memory, hope, and subtle fear converged, creating a soft map for decision and reflection. The mind felt its own rhythms, measured and steady, guiding movement toward internal resolution. Even the faintest gestures, shifted posture, a quiet sigh, a slow blink, became part of the narrative of endurance. Awareness of self and circumstance merged into a rhythm of quiet persistence. Each moment, though heavy with subtle pressure, allowed reflection to deepen, awareness to expand, and resilience to assert itself. In this calm tension, surrender and strength were inseparable, two sides of a quiet equilibrium, and as the hour waned, the mind remained attentive, soft and deliberate, poised between choice and acceptance. Outside, the world moved steadily, unaware of the quiet transformations occurring within. The fragile hour left an imprint on both thought and memory. Even after the room emptied, its soft rhythm lingered, influencing perception and reflection. Fear, hope, memory, and endurance had danced together in quiet harmony, shaping awareness gently yet indelibly. Each internal choice, each reflection, each quiet concession became part of a slow, enduring rhythm of experience. The mind, tested yet resilient, carried forward the echoes of this subtle negotiation. In these quiet passages of time, the human spirit was both observed and exercised, shaped without spectacle, influenced without force. The fragile hour passed like soft water over stone, leaving its trace in the slow architecture of thought, and in its wake, the rhythm of endurance continued, carrying quietly into the next chapter of human experience. The mind remained awake, attentive, and softly illuminated, ready for the moments to come. The archive was quiet, almost reverent, as though the air itself knew the weight it carried. Rows of shelves stretched into soft shadow, each folder a whisper of a life once lived. Paper, ink, and meticulous notation recorded stories of fear, obedience, and resilience, leaving human presence distilled into careful lines. The smell of aged paper, faint and dry, seemed to mingle with the faint coolness of the room, creating a calm but somber atmosphere. Clerks moved with careful attention, their steps slow, deliberate, absorbing the rhythm of order rather than urgency. Every file contained countless small details, letters, dates, and observations, forming a lattice of observation and memory. Even in its thoroughness, the archive was silent, allowing reflection to drift through its aisles without interruption. It was a room where control met documentation, where methodical attention to detail became a substitute for presence. And as fingers traced folder edges, the past seemed to settle softly into the mind of the observer. Each folder seemed to hold a quiet story, a life condensed into lines of notation. Names, addresses, and notes formed patterns, revealing connections, decisions, and the faintest tremors of choice. The archivists, trained in the gentle rhythms of order, approached their work with patience and calm precision. Time seemed slower here, measured not by clocks but by the careful movement of hands across paper. Even the smallest annotation could carry significance, a subtle hint of behavior, a flicker of hesitation, a record of compliance. The act of recording was itself a form of quiet authority, a soft assertion of control over memory and reality. And yet, the more complete the record, the more the humanity of those involved seemed to slip into abstraction. Each document was at once a testament and a whisper, leaving a delicate imprint on the mind of anyone who lingered. In this quiet, the room offered both information and reflection, fact and emotional resonance coexisting in slow, gentle layers. The archive breathed softly, its presence a quiet bridge between history and human understanding. The methodical order of the files mirrored the methodical order of the city itself. Bureaucracy became a rhythm, a pattern that shaped behavior and perception beyond the walls of the archive. Each piece of paper was a node in a vast network, connecting observation, record, and influence into a silent web. Even the smallest details were significant. A line crossed out, a note added, a date carefully recorded. The archivists, themselves part of this system, moved with quiet attentiveness, aware of the responsibility their work carried. They understood that documentation was not neutral. It was a conduit of control, shaping memory as much as recording it. And yet, in the hush of these rooms, the work carried a solemn dignity, a quiet acknowledgement of lives now distilled into ink and paper. Reflection flowed easily here, encouraged by the calm repetition of order and the weight of recorded history. Each folder, once closed, left a soft echo in the mind, a reminder of continuity and absence. And through these echoes, the story of control extended silently beyond the archive's walls. The paradox of documentation became evident. Total control required total observation, total record. And yet it could never capture the entirety of life. Every act of human choice, every subtle hesitation, and every whispered fear was reduced to notation. The archive contained precision but not essence, clarity but not warmth, completeness but not soul. And in this careful balance the mind could wander, tracing both method and absence, presence and erasure. Each clerk, conscious or not, participated in this delicate choreography, translating human experience into calm, legible form. Even as order was maintained, the weight of humanity pressed softly against the walls, a reminder that lives are never fully captured by paper. The rhythm of filing and cataloging became meditative, an exercise in focus, reflection, and quiet observation. And in these movements, history and method intertwined, creating a space of both insight and somber contemplation. The archive, silent and deliberate, held both knowledge and a whisper of loss. Through it, the mind continued its slow journey into understanding. The meticulous records also preserved subtle patterns of fear and compliance. Names repeated, notes aligned, connections emerged, forming a quiet map of influence and observation. Each folder, when viewed as part of the larger collection, revealed networks of thought, choice, and response. It was a catalogue not just of individuals, but of rhythm and expectation, an invisible architecture of psychological insight. Archivists worked with awareness, understanding that every entry contributed to a broader pattern, even as the individuals behind the paper became distant echoes. Their hands moved gently, following the soft pulse of organization, guided by both method and instinct. And in the repetition of filing, organizing, and noting, the quiet intensity of control could be sensed, subtle and pervasive. The archive was not a place of spectacle, but of rhythm, reflection, and understanding, a measured testimony to the quiet labor of observation. And in this calm, the archive allowed both method and memory to linger together, softly and without intrusion. The hum of silent presence threaded through the rows of files, persistent yet gentle. The archive was also a reflection of paradoxical care. Every detail was attended to with precision, yet the human behind it was abstracted, softened into numbers, dates, and notes. Attention to formality became a meditation, and repetition became a subtle, quiet song of organization. The meticulous structure allowed for reflection on both method and consequence, on the act of control and the lives it shaped. Even small variations, a handwritten note, an annotation, held significance, emphasizing the careful observation underlying the entire system. This gentle attention gave the archive both authority and atmosphere, a quiet presence that invited reflection rather than command. And as archivists moved through the aisles, handling folders with care, they engaged in a rhythm of understanding and preservation. Each action carried meaning, a deliberate movement in the soft architecture of documentation. The quiet accumulation of observation created a space of thoughtfulness and meditation. And through this calm, the archive's influence extended softly into memory and understanding. Even silence contributed to the archive's power. Empty aisles, softly lit corners, and the faint rustle of paper became part of the environment, shaping perception and thought. The mind, moving slowly through this space, absorbed not only records but the subtle rhythm of care, order, and quiet authority. Each folder, each annotation became a node in an interconnected system, a soft echo of method and influence. The archivists, conscious of the weight they carried, maintained a pace that encouraged reflection and gentle awareness. The cumulative presence of documentation created a calm intensity, a quiet insistence that knowledge mattered even in its abstraction. Memory and record intertwined, forming a rhythm that guided thought without demanding action. And in this delicate balance of order and absence, the archive became both instrument and mirror. Through it, the past persisted softly, accessible yet ethereal, detailed yet incomplete. Each passage through the aisles left an imprint on thought, gentle and enduring. And as attention lingered on each folder, the mind moved toward reflection, calm and attentive. Finally, the archive was a testament to method as much as to history. The quiet dedication of clerks, the meticulous arrangement of files, and the soft rhythm of documentation exemplified the subtle power of order. Each folder, each page, each note was part of a measured system, a rhythm of thought and observation extended across space and time. Control was exercised not through immediate action, but through preparation, anticipation, and meticulous attention. And yet, amid this calm order, traces of humanity persisted, small imperfections, smudges of ink, faded handwriting, moments that hinted at life beyond record. The archive in its stillness allowed reflection on method, consequence, and absence alike. It was a space where thought moved gently, where history was both preserved and softened, and where the quiet rhythm of documentation carried a subtle, hypnotic weight. Each passing moment in its presence was a meditation on control, memory, and the soft persistence of method. And through this calm, the narrative drifted onward, carrying attention to the unfolding chapters of influence, observation, and human consequence. The methods perfected in Berlin traveled quietly, folding themselves into streets, offices, and homes across Europe. In Paris, the rhythm of surveillance whispered through cafes and narrow alleys, subtle as the sound of a door closing. Norway's fjords carried the quiet steps of observation, the wind shifting lightly over towns that sensed eyes in unexpected corners. Even in the vast expanses of Soviet territories, the same patterns emerged, patience and attention, marking every gesture, every pause, every small human action. The Gestapo adapted seamlessly, softening their approach for local custom, yet preserving the internal cadence of expectation and control. Language changed, customs varied, but the rhythm remained consistent and gentle, like a river flowing beneath many bridges. Citizens unaware of the subtle choreography adjusted behavior as instinctively as breathing. Observers recorded, analyzed, and guided with calm attentiveness, ensuring the method survived translation. The web extending outward maintained a quiet consistency that was almost imperceptible but profound in effect. And through each adaptation, the pulse of control remained steady, echoing softly across distant lands. The subtle art of observation grew more sophisticated as it spread. Every region offered new cues, minor adjustments that shaped human response without startling or forceful imposition. In cafes and offices, quiet glances, measured hesitation, and pauses became gentle instruments of anticipation. The rhythm of questioning, waiting, and listening remained unchanged. Though local cadences shaped delivery, officers learned the language of subtlety in each culture, combining patience with gentle persuasion. The network of compliance extended organically, a lattice of observation, suggestion, and careful attention. Fear, soft and persistent, wove into routines, conversations, and public life, shaping perception slowly. Each new territory revealed human behavior in slightly different light, yet responded predictably to rhythm and expectation. And as the web expanded, the system's quiet influence spread like an invisible tide, steady and unbroken. Every interaction, no matter how small, became part of a larger pattern that transcended borders. Even in occupied towns, ordinary gestures carried amplified meaning. A pause in conversation, a hesitant greeting, a subtle avoidance of gaze, all became nodes of attention and insight. Observers catalogued these details meticulously, noting trends, exceptions, and adjustments in behavior. The pattern of human compliance extended beyond individual encounters, forming a quiet architecture of social expectation. Local officers trained in the rhythm of Berlin's methods enacted these measures with gentle precision, blending authority with subtle suggestion. Everyday spaces, cafes, train stations, workplaces became laboratories for understanding and guiding thought. Even absence was meaningful when someone was missing. The rhythm shifted, attention sharpened, and observation continued quietly. The same principles applied everywhere: patience, anticipation, and subtle influence, rather than overt force. And in each corner of the continent, the pulse of control followed the same measured cadence. Observation and guidance traveled softly across languages, landscapes, and customs. And through this calm extension, the web of authority became both invisible and pervasive. The process was not uniform in appearance, yet it was remarkably consistent in essence. In some towns, the method emphasized suggestion, in others, observation, yet in all rhythm ruled. Officers relied upon patient reading of human behavior, interpreting hesitation, tone, and gesture as data. Even in moments that seemed ordinary, the invisible hand of subtle influence guided thought and action. Citizens moved carefully, adjusting naturally, unaware that the rhythm had entered their perception. Each territory contributed to the overall architecture, offering insight into human response across cultures. Local customs, dialects, and traditions were respected outwardly, while the internal method of control persisted quietly and steadily. And as the network stretched, the Gestapo refined the art of adaptation, keeping the essence of influence constant. In every village, town, and city, the pulse of observation maintained its soft but insistent presence, and through these small adjustments, the quiet reach of control spread steadily, almost imperceptibly. The uniformity of fear across borders was eerie in its subtlety. Though languages changed, the human response remained consistent. Hesitation, measured speech, and cautious movement marked behavior. Officers observed these markers gently, noting conformity, deviation, and subtle shifts over time. The rhythm of compliance transcended speech, culture, and geography, functioning as a soft, omnipresent guide. Citizens adapted unconsciously, internalizing expectation before instruction arrived, creating a collective, quiet tension. Even small gestures of attention, nodding, leaning, looking away, were recorded and interpreted. The network was not immediately visible, yet it persisted in a slow, steady pulse, shaping perception and action. Through consistent application of patient observation and subtle guidance, influence extended without spectacle or alarm, and across the continent, the soft, unbroken rhythm of control whispered through streets, homes, and workplaces alike. Each place, though unique in detail, responded predictably to the quiet architecture of authority. The expansion relied upon both observation and adaptation, a careful balance maintained across varied terrain. Officers studied patterns, adjusting methods for local rhythm, while keeping the core technique intact. Every pause, glance, and hesitation was noted, catalogued, and used to guide further interaction. Even absence was informative. Missing voices, silent rooms, and unspoken gestures became part of the soft data set. The rhythm of influence operated quietly, invisible yet persuasive, shaping behavior before instruction was given. Citizens, moving in awareness of subtle expectation, adjusted unconsciously, following patterns imposed by patient observation. Local practices, social norms, and cultural rhythms were integrated into the method without breaking the central cadence. And in this way, the web expanded efficiently, quietly reinforcing itself across languages, landscapes, and time zones. Each interaction contributed to a broader pattern, a network of calm yet persistent influence. And through this slow, deliberate spread, the rhythm of authority carried gently forward. Even as the network extended to distant regions, its subtlety remained central. Influence was never imposed abruptly. It flowed gradually, adjusting thought and expectation through gentle guidance. Observation, suggestion, and anticipation maintained their primacy, ensuring compliance without alarm. In every occupied town, the familiar rhythm emerged: hesitation, pause, reflection, subtle reassurance, soft correction. Citizens adapted instinctively, moving within the soft current of expectation, unaware of its pervasive touch. The network strengthened quietly, linking distant regions through pattern, method, and rhythm. Each expansion offered new insight into human behavior, while reinforcing established principles, and through careful application, the Gestapo's reach became as silent as it was steady, consistent in cadence, even across vast distances. The web, though invisible, carried a steady, hypnotic pulse that echoed softly through occupied Europe. And through these layers of subtle influence, the story of quiet control drifted gently toward its next chapter. As the methods reached their farthest points, the unbroken rhythm of control became apparent. Though languages, landscapes, and customs varied, the underlying cadence persisted. Calm yet persistent, soft yet pervasive. Citizens living within this network adjusted behavior subtly, guided more by anticipation than by instruction. Observation and suggestion intertwined across borders, forming a network that was simultaneously adaptive and uniform. Even in distant regions, subtle cues, gestures, pauses, glances were interpreted consistently, reinforcing the architecture of influence. Officers moved gently through their duties, applying patient guidance rather than force, maintaining consistency without intrusion. Each interaction, catalogued and reflected upon, became part of a larger continuous rhythm. The web of control, expanding quietly yet steadily, carried its influence through subtle repetition, soft expectation, and gentle observation. And as it stretched across the continent, the pulse of authority persisted, guiding thought and action without disturbance. Through this quiet network, the story moved onward, soft and unbroken, into the next unfolding chapter. In the quiet hours between assignments, the interrogators often saw themselves reflected in still surfaces, in mirrors, in the calm of domestic spaces. They were ordinary men, threading carefully between family breakfasts, gentle conversations, and the meticulous routines of home. At work, they maintained a precise rhythm, patient and attentive. Yet at home, the rhythm softened into habit, into small acts of care and attention. They convinced themselves of duty, of service, of the necessity of order, and in these convictions, moral blindness took root. Reflection became a gentle partition, separating the life of home from the life of method, the comfort of hearth from the rigor of procedure. Every gesture at the table, every whispered conversation with a spouse or child seemed untethered from the controlled, deliberate world of interrogation. And yet the mind was never entirely divided. Faint echoes of expectation, observation, and influence lingered softly, like the trailing notes of a song. They carried both roles with careful attention, negotiating silence and action, instinct and reflection. And in this oscillation between worlds, the rhythm of inner life continued, calm and unbroken. Each day folded into the next, carrying reflection forward into another quiet pause. They told themselves stories of necessity, of order, of contributing to something larger than themselves. Each rationalization softened awareness, creating space for comfort alongside detachment. In the office, gestures, pauses, and questions followed a carefully rehearsed rhythm, guided by training, method, and observation. At home, those same hands could fold laundry, pour coffee, or straighten a picture with gentle care. The mind adjusted seamlessly between these worlds, smoothing edges and softening contrasts. Moral tension remained, but it was cushioned by repetition, habit, and the quiet reassurance of familiar routine. They rarely confronted the dissonance directly, preferring the soft rhythm of work and home, thought and action, duty and domesticity. Even in quiet reflection, the duality persisted, subtle yet persistent, a gentle counterpoint to daily life. And in this oscillation, each man preserved the illusion of continuity, a soft balance between inner conscience and external expectation. The day carried on, calm, deliberate, and measured, leaving space for the mind to drift quietly into reflection. Family dinners, shared laughter, or the simple act of preparing a morning meal offered a gentle counterpoint to the rhythm of interrogation. The mind adjusted to these domestic patterns, absorbing warmth, care, and softness into its quiet folds. At work, every hesitation, glance, and pause was observed, measured, and interpreted. At home, small gestures of affection and attentiveness required no calculation, flowing naturally from habit and love. The contrast was not violent but soft, a gentle alternation between spheres of influence and spheres of intimacy. Reflection occurred quietly, in the gaps between actions, in the spaces left by routine and attention. Even in the mind, moral reconciliation was subtle, mediated by repetition, ritual, and self-assurance. Each day offered a gentle cadence, moving between observation and comfort, anticipation and ease, method and care. And through these alternating rhythms, the interrogators navigated the delicate terrain of conscience, often without realizing its quiet weight. In this soft tension, the story of human adaptation continued, calm yet persistent. Their professional detachment was a carefully maintained rhythm, a dance of attention, timing, and control. The mind measured hesitation, tone, gesture, and pause, calibrating influence with gentle precision. At home, the same mind softened, absorbing the rhythm of routine, the warmth of domesticity, and the gentle expectation of familiarity. Even as they navigated these dual worlds, awareness of moral dissonance lingered softly at the edges, like a distant note barely audible. They observed without judgment at work, yet the same gaze trained for subtlety and nuance could detect small shifts in home, faint signs of happiness, concern, or need. These dualities were navigated carefully, with patient attention and deliberate calm, and in the gentle oscillation between method and intimacy, the mind created its own quiet equilibrium, soft and persistent. Everyday acts, repeated rhythmically, carried meaning beyond immediate observation, shaping thought and perception. The mirror of the mind reflected both worlds, faintly overlapping, softly intertwining. And in this quiet reflection, the story of ordinary human adaptation unfolded, slow, calm, and attentive. Even small acts revealed the tension between professional and private life. A careful nod at work, a quiet encouragement at home, each gesture carried subtle weight. Observation, method, and influence guided behavior in one space, while care, warmth, and reassurance guided it in another. The mind adjusted seamlessly, shifting cadence, tone, and attention according to circumstance. Guilt or reflection, if it arose, was cushioned by habit, narrative, and the soft rhythms of domestic life. Even the most deliberate training could not erase the comfort of routine, nor could routine erase the insistence of expectation. Every day, the soft interplay of observation and care, control and attention, method and habit, shaped the inner landscape, and in this oscillation, moral blindness became not abrupt or forceful, but a gentle, almost invisible companion. Reflection continued, soft as a whisper, threading through the rhythm of daily life. And through this subtle balancing act, the story of human adaptation persisted quietly, measured and enduring. The mirror also revealed small contradictions, faint yet persistent, that guided thought without harsh intrusion. Actions performed with calm precision in professional spheres might contrast with moments of softness at home. The mind adjusted rhythmically, moving between methodical attention and gentle care. Each pause, each gesture, each reflection carried weight, shaping perception and response in subtle ways. Even in the quiet of morning or evening, echoes of procedure lingered softly, like distant music, influencing posture, tone, and thought. Habit and routine smoothed these edges, allowing a gentle transition between observation and intimacy. And as each day unfolded, these subtle adjustments formed a quiet pattern, invisible yet consistent, shaping character and conscience alike. Reflection, soft and deliberate, threaded through every act, gently connecting professional detachment with private presence. In this calm interplay, the story of human adaptation and moral negotiation drifted quietly forward. The rhythm persisted, slow, deliberate, and hypnotic. Awareness of duty and domesticity intertwined, sometimes imperceptibly, forming a delicate balance of conscience. The mind reconciled expectation with care, authority with warmth, method with intimacy. Even hesitation or doubt was absorbed into routine, softened by repetition and narrative. Professional rigor and personal gentleness became parallel streams, flowing quietly side by side. Observation and reflection continued in tandem, neither harsh nor sudden, always measured, always calm. Each gesture of attention, each act of care, became a note in a quiet rhythm that shaped perception and awareness. The mirror of the mind reflected the oscillation of these forces, subtle, persistent, and hypnotic, and in this soft reflection, the interrogators maintained equilibrium, navigating duality without abrupt disruption. The quiet narrative of adaptation extended beyond immediate observation, moving gently into the next chapter of unfolding story, and the mind, attentive yet calm, continued its quiet journey. Even in reflection, moral dissonance remained faint but persistent, softened by habit and reassurance. The rhythm of work and home, expectation and intimacy, suggestion and care, carried forward quietly, shaping thought without alarm. The mind adjusted to the alternating spheres, negotiating calm with observation, warmth with method, reflection with attention. Each repetition reinforced rhythm, pattern, and subtle reconciliation, creating a steady current beneath daily life. Observation, expectation, and suggestion continued to echo softly, threading through moments of domestic calm. The mirror, ever patient, reflected these gentle shifts, creating awareness without intrusion, reflection without judgment. And in this quiet balance, the duality of existence, detachment and intimacy, method and care, duty and life, was navigated with calm precision. Awareness deepened gently, flowing slowly into the next moments of experience. The rhythm persisted, soft and unbroken, carrying thought toward quiet understanding, and in this oscillation, the mind remained attentive, reflective, and softly hypnotic. The mirror of the mind offered both insight and quiet meditation. Observation, attention, and care moved in gentle alternation, shaping daily life without force. Even moral blindness, though present, was cushioned, softened by narrative, repetition, and gentle routine. Professional detachment coexisted with domestic warmth, each rhythm influencing the other softly and persistently. Small gestures, subtle awareness, and quiet reflection threaded through each day, creating a calm architecture of habit and perception. And as the mind moved between spheres, it absorbed the faint tension of duality, allowing reflection, adjustment, and persistence. The story of human adaptation unfolded slowly, rhythmically, quietly, and enduringly. And as the day closed, the gentle oscillation of method and intimacy carried forward, drifting softly into the next chapter of narrative exploration. In this calm reflection, the mind remained steady, aware, and hypnotically attentive. Silence in the hands of the Gestapo was a tool as deliberate as any written order or spoken command. It moved through streets, offices, and homes, subtle yet persistent, shaping behavior without uttering a word. Citizens adjusted instinctively, the absence of sound or direction creating anticipation, hesitation, and careful observation. The system required minimal action to maintain maximal influence, a quiet architecture of control that extended without visible effort. Even empty rooms carried meaning, each pause in conversation, each gentle hesitation, conveying expectation and warning. Officers understood the rhythm of anticipation, using it to guide thought, decision, and compliance. Silence became a measure of attention, a tool that shaped minds through absence rather than presence. And in this quiet, pervasive control, fear was a gentle undercurrent, present without need for demonstration. Each day followed the rhythm, measured by expectation, anticipation, and the soft pull of unseen observation. And as silence settled, it carried the weight of authority calmly but unmistakably forward. The system functioned with subtle precision, using absence and calm repetition to influence the many. Even minor gestures, a glance, a pause, a measured sigh, were sufficient to transmit expectation and intent. The population moved gently within this rhythm, adjusting behavior instinctively, guided by the soft pulse of unspoken rules. Officers maintained observation without intrusion, letting the quiet work as an invisible instructor. In every home, street, and workplace, the pattern repeated, reinforcing itself slowly, deliberately, and without spectacle. The soft architecture of silence allowed the system to operate continuously, shaping thought, perception, and behavior with quiet efficiency. Citizens, aware yet uncertain, learned the gentle cadence of compliance, internalizing the rhythm, without overt instruction. Each subtle adjustment carried lessons, reinforcing expectation and minimizing need for visible intervention. And in this calm, pervasive order, control was exercised smoothly, quietly, and entirely effectively. The machine of silence hummed softly, extending its quiet influence without pause. The mastery of silence relied upon understanding human perception in its most delicate forms. Anticipation, hesitation, and expectation were measured carefully, each movement noted and catalogued, each pause a node of subtle influence. The system did not rush, nor did it rely on overt display. Its power rested in patient, persistent application of quiet. Citizens moved gently within the architecture of observation, guided by unseen patterns that shaped thought as naturally as rhythm guides breath. Even absence became communicative, a signal understood without interpretation, a lesson absorbed through instinct and repetition. Officers trained in subtlety maintained the cadence, attending to gesture, posture, and pause, translating behavior into soft guidance. Each day reinforced the architecture, the quiet pulse of compliance threading slowly through streets, offices, and homes. And in this gentle mastery, influence flowed effortlessly, quietly shaping perception without disruption. The rhythm of silence became both instruction and expectation, calm yet insistent, soft yet pervasive. And as it moved through communities, the machine of silence carried forward its quiet authority, unbroken and steady. The elegance of the system was found in its economy of action. Minimal intervention yielded maximum influence, a gentle orchestration of expectation, observation, and anticipation. Citizens moved naturally within its soft current, unaware of the subtle forces guiding each gesture, pause, and word. The rhythm of control was slow and steady, measured not by decree but by habitual response, internalized and sustained. Officers allowed spaces, moments, and silences to communicate lessons without intrusion. Even fear, though present, flowed quietly, a faint undercurrent rather than a sudden torrent. The pulse of influence extended in gentle, unbroken waves, shaping perception with patience rather than force. Each gesture of observation reinforced rhythm, expectation, and compliance, creating a network of soft control. And in this slow, deliberate extension, the Gestapo achieved mastery over both environment and human response. The machine of silence persisted, calm, pervasive, and hypnotically steady. The quiet nature of authority created its own subtle rhythm. Pauses between words, the absence of guidance, and the gentle insistence of observation produced compliance without resistance. Citizens internalized expectation, modulating behavior through anticipation rather than compulsion. Each minor interaction carried soft instruction, a subtle shaping of thought, subtly repeated until it became second nature. Officers themselves, guided by training and habit, maintained attention without intrusion, observing, noting, and adjusting rhythm as required. Even when absent, authority persisted, carried in memory, anticipation, and reflection. The slow, steady cadence of the system shaped perception effortlessly, threading influence into daily life without forceful imposition. And as each day passed, the rhythm persisted, calm, measured, and quietly insistent. The machine of silence, invisible and continuous, extended its reach across streets, homes, and hearts alike. Through this pervasive quiet, the story of control moved softly onward. In every occupied town, city, and village, the rhythm of silence was felt, subtle yet profound. Streets and workplaces carried the soft hum of anticipation, the gentle expectation of unseen observation. Citizens adjusted instinctively, internalizing instruction without direct confrontation, guided by the careful cadence of subtle control. Officers worked quietly, maintaining the rhythm, noting pauses, gestures, and unspoken cues, translating observation into soft guidance. Even the smallest shifts in tone, hesitation, or glance became instructive, contributing to the pervasive pulse of expectation. The system thrived in its patient, understated approach, extending influence without spectacle or alarm. Each day reinforced rhythm, building compliance gently, steadily, and imperceptibly. And in this slow, deliberate process, control became effortless, pervasive, and almost hypnotic. The machine of silence operated continuously, quietly shaping perception without visible motion. And through this calm mastery, the narrative drifted naturally toward reflection, observation, and the next chapter. The peak of the Gestapo's mastery lay not in action, but in anticipation. Citizens adjusted behavior before instruction arrived, guided by the soft pulse of expectation, instinct and experience. Observation and subtle influence became entwined, shaping thought gently, persistently, and imperceptibly. Officers intervened minimally, their presence a quiet guide rather than a forceful hand. The rhythm of silence shaped perception, creating habitual compliance that extended throughout streets, homes, and workplaces. Even in the absence of commands, the system's influence persisted, threading quietly through daily life. Each gesture, pause, or slight glance reinforced the pattern, guiding action and perception without notice. The subtlety of approach ensured continuity, efficiency, and near invisibility of influence, and in this soft, persistent rhythm, the machine of silence reached its quiet peak, calm, hypnotic, and unbroken. Through it the story of control drifted gently onward, measured and unrelenting. Silence became both teacher and enforcer, a quiet pulse threading through every encounter. The system relied upon soft repetition, gentle anticipation, and patient observation, guiding behavior without overt demonstration. Citizens absorbed expectation naturally, modulating thought, gesture, and speech to align with unseen rhythm. Even absence communicated, presence reassured, and minimal intervention sufficed to maintain influence. Officers moved gently, maintaining focus, rhythm, and cadence, translating observation into soft guidance. The architecture of control was subtle, persistent, and pervasive, shaping perception gently but firmly. Each day extended the rhythm, reinforcing quiet compliance and anticipation across towns, streets, and homes. And as the pulse of influence persisted, the machine of silence maintained its calm mastery, soft, continuous, and hypnotically steady. Through this gentle orchestration, the story of control carried forward into the next unfolding chapter of quiet reflection. And in the pervasive hush, both method and memory continued to drift, soft, unbroken, and eternal. Even the most precise systems built with patience and care can show faint signs of wear, subtle fractures that reveal themselves quietly. Within the ranks of the Gestapo, murmurs of doubt began to appear, soft and almost imperceptible, threading through corridors and offices. Officers who once followed rhythm and procedure without hesitation now hesitated themselves, sensing the weight of their actions. Quiet disillusionment crept in, not as a sudden eruption, but as a gentle awareness that control and morality could diverge. Some found themselves questioning the purpose behind repeated observation and subtle influence, wondering if the human cost, though unseen, was greater than imagined. Even the architecture of silence, once smooth and pervasive, felt brittle under the soft pressure of conscience. And in private spaces at night, or in solitude, officers reflected quietly, wrestling with discomfort that had no immediate resolution. The system continued outwardly, its pulse unbroken, yet beneath the surface, subtle tremors began to ripple through routines. Moral hesitation, soft and persistent, influenced small choices and gestures, shifting rhythm ever so slightly. And through these quiet cracks, the story of human awareness moved gently forward. The first signs of resistance were subtle, almost invisible to those not looking closely. A hesitation in recording, a lingering glance, a note of doubt passed quietly between colleagues, all small disruptions in an otherwise unbroken cadence. These interruptions were gentle but persistent, seeping through the rhythm of observation and control. Some officers found that even the most practiced methods no longer aligned neatly with conscience. Questions arose softly, like whispers in empty rooms. Could influence become harm, and could obedience become complicity? The contrast between domestic life and professional duty widened, making reflection unavoidable. These moments of quiet doubt were rarely voiced aloud, but they shaped thought, perception, and action in imperceptible ways. As the days progressed, the steady rhythm of control encountered these subtle interruptions, slowing just slightly, as if sensing its own fragility. Even in continued operation, the system seemed less absolute, its edges softened by hesitation, and through these faint tremors, the narrative moved gently into reflection, awareness, and quiet change. Guilt began to seep softly into consciousness, faint at first, like a distant echo, then growing slowly, persistently. Officers who once moved with calm precision now carried traces of unease in posture, tone, and rhythm. Their minds oscillated between memory and method, weighing the consequences of small actions and gestures. Observation and silence, once seamless and effective, began to feel heavy, burdened with moral reflection. Some attempted to reconcile duty with conscience, seeking patterns that might justify action or minimize harm. Yet reconciliation proved elusive, leaving only soft disquiet, a whisper of awareness threading through each day. Even the architecture of control, solid and pervasive, showed faint cracks when measured against conscience and human empathy. The rhythm of silence persisted outwardly, yet within subtle turbulence disturbed equilibrium. Small choices, adjustments, and hesitations accumulated quietly, softening the edge of authority. And as guilt threaded its way through thought, the narrative drifted gently toward awareness and reflection. Quiet dissent manifested not as rebellion, but in subtle acts of human hesitation. Officers delayed reports, questioned phrasing, or softened phrasing in documentation. The pulse of obedience slowed imperceptibly, like a river meeting gentle resistance from hidden stones. Even when no action changed externally, the rhythm of the system was affected, its previously seamless cadence now interrupted by reflection and doubt. Conversations with peers carried undertones of questioning, though spoken softly, rarely acknowledged directly. The moral interior, private and unspoken, became a space for contemplation, weighing personal responsibility against systemic expectation. Each soft act of hesitation, each question posed quietly, chipped away at the perception of infallibility. Observers began to notice these shifts, subtle as they were, and adjusted rhythm unconsciously, sensing change without fully understanding its source. And in this quiet erosion of certainty, the narrative moved gently forward, preparing the system for reflection, reconsideration, and the eventual drift of compliance. The rhythm persisted, but in a softer, more fragile cadence. Even as cracks appeared, the outward structure remained, maintaining appearance while faltering within. Citizens unaware of these subtle internal changes continued to respond to rhythm and expectation as before. Yet within offices, quiet reflection created a gentle turbulence, soft enough not to break routine, but persistent enough to alter perception. Officers wrestled with the duality of obedience and conscience, a tension that shaped thought, posture, and interaction subtly yet consistently. Moral hesitation softened the pulse of influence, creating spaces where reflection could breathe. Some found themselves drawn to the humanity of those they observed, questioning whether subtle manipulation crossed the line into harm. The interplay between duty and awareness persisted in gentle oscillation, measured and reflective. Even in continued operation, the system was no longer seamless. It carried a faint tremor of internal unrest, and in this quiet uncertainty, the narrative unfolded, threading gently toward conscience, empathy, and human awareness. The rhythm remained, but its edges were softened by subtle reflection. The cracks were not sudden but cumulative, small fissures that spread slowly over time. Repetition, once a source of rhythm and calm, now invited contemplation, highlighting the moral cost of habitual observation. Officers noticed these shifts, though rarely named them aloud, experiencing them as a soft unease, a gentle resistance within. The system continued to function, its pulse outwardly smooth, yet internally doubt and reflection intertwined with method. Each hesitation carried meaning, each small act of questioning shaped rhythm in imperceptible ways. Even silence, once a tool of mastery, now invited reflection, allowing conscience to weigh upon thought quietly. The juxtaposition of personal morality against systemic expectation created a subtle tension, threading gently through daily activity. Small fissures widened softly, influencing rhythm and perception in ways unspoken yet profound. And through this patient erosion, the story of human conscience moved quietly forward, gentle but persistent. The system remained, but its edges were softened by the human mind's quiet questioning. Internal reflection brought clarity. Even as it threatened rhythm, officers began to recognize patterns of discomfort and hesitation, observing themselves with the same careful attention they had once reserved for others. Questions about duty, morality, and consequence circulated within, unspoken but persistent. Soft as a whisper, even habitual gestures, once mechanical and precise, began to carry emotional weight, resonating softly with conscience. The oscillation between obedience and moral awareness became a quiet dance, subtle yet pervasive. Each day offered space for reflection, gently shaping thought without interrupting outward rhythm. The cracks, though gentle, spread awareness, allowing observation and introspection to coexist with duty. Even the smooth architecture of control now bore the faint marks of reflection, hesitation, and doubt. And in this soft awareness, the narrative drifted gently, threading toward conscience, quiet change, and subtle evolution. The pulse of authority remained, but it was quieter, tempered by human reflection. Small acts of courage, though unspoken, began to manifest gently within the ranks. Questioned phrasing, careful observation, and minor adjustments indicated a mind wrestling with morality softly and persistently. The rhythm of compliance, once unbroken, now accommodated hesitation, reflection, and empathy in subtle ways. Even in the absence of overt dissent, the system felt these quiet pressures, shifting rhythm imperceptibly, yet meaningfully. Citizens continued outward routines, unaware that subtle transformations were occurring within those who observed them. The interplay of moral awareness and professional expectation created a delicate, unspoken negotiation of behavior and reflection. Each day carried forward the quiet tension, threading observation with conscience, method with thought, and influence with reflection. The cracks in the mirror allowed space for awareness, soft as a whisper, persistent as rhythm, and delicate as a sigh. And through this gentle erosion, the story of internal human change continued to drift calmly, hypnotically, and uninterrupted toward the next chapter of quiet transformation. The currents of war shifted slowly, imperceptibly at first, yet with a certainty that could not be ignored. The hunters, once steady and confident, found themselves sensing a subtle change in rhythm, a quiet unease threading through their days. The city streets, once disciplined by anticipation and silence, now carried new whispers, faint tremors of uncertainty and possibility. Even the careful measures of observation could not insulate them from the ripple of larger events beyond their control. Officers began to notice small gaps in routine, minor deviations that had previously been impossible, hinting at a subtle reversal of power. Fear, once a tool wielded outwardly, now curved inward, brushing softly against their consciousness. Private reflection, once quiet and optional, became necessary, as each individual began to sense the fragility of authority. Even habitual gestures previously executed without thought took on the weight of anticipation, shaped by the shifting current of events, and in this gentle, pervasive shift, the pulse of the system began to falter, measured not by action, but by awareness. The turning tide moved slowly, almost imperceptibly, yet inexorably, carrying the story forward toward quiet reckoning. The rhythm of anticipation that had guided so many lives outwardly now oscillated inward, turning the hunter into the observed. Officers moved with soft caution, noticing pauses in conversation, subtle glances, and the faint hum of uncertainty that filled empty spaces. Each moment required recalibration, each gesture measured anew, as the certainty of control loosened. The landscape of fear that had once been imposed upon others now pressed gently upon themselves, a quiet reflection of their own methods. Even the system of silence, once so absolute, began to hum with faint disturbance, carrying unspoken tension through halls and offices. They felt the rhythm of observation shift, as citizens, neighbors, and subordinates began to act in ways unpredictable, yet quiet, subtle, yet persistent. In private reflection, conscience became more insistent, threading softly through thought and posture alike. And as each day progressed, the subtle reversal became clearer, shaping action, hesitation, and expectation in delicate, pervasive ways. The tide of war, slow and measured, carried with it the whisper of poetic justice, unfolding gently, softly, yet irrevocably. And through this quiet shift, the narrative moved onward, calm yet charged with anticipation. Even routine gestures now carried weight, shadows of the shift visible in the smallest motions. Notes were reconsidered, pauses lingered longer, and steps moved with a soft, deliberate caution. The rhythm of observation, once confident and smooth, felt interrupted, each act resonating with a faint echo of uncertainty. Officers reflected quietly, aware that patterns that had guided action flawlessly could no longer assure predictability. The architecture of control, subtle and pervasive, now seemed less absolute, like a lattice of fine threads stretched taut, quivering under invisible pressure. Each moment of hesitation was a gentle signal, a soft note in a slowly changing harmony. Even domestic routines, familiar and comforting, carried the undertone of tension, as the mind anticipated a world in quiet flux. Observation and self-awareness intertwined delicately, creating a rhythm both cautious and reflective. And in this careful balance, the turning tide moved forward, gentle but unmistakable, threading through consciousness and behavior alike. The soft currents of change carried them quietly toward uncertainty, measured yet inevitable. The hunters became aware, slowly, that the landscape itself was shifting beneath them. Even streets and workplaces, long guided by expectation, began to hum with subtle unpredictability. The pulse of routine, once unbroken, now wavered under the weight of unseen pressures and shifting loyalties. They observed quietly, measuring hesitation and change, while internally sensing the rhythm of power reverse. The architecture of silence, previously absolute, began to carry hints of disruption. Whispers of observation returned in ways previously unimaginable. Even the smallest deviations, a glance, a question, a pause, felt amplified, echoing softly through the structures of command. Internal reflection deepened, as officers questioned the durability of influence, control, and expectation. The familiar cadence of duty was tempered now by caution and uncertainty, soft yet persistent, and in this gentle unraveling, the story of shifting authority moved forward, quiet but undeniable. The tide turned slowly, carrying both awareness and anticipation in equal measure. Even the mind's habitual patterns began to adjust to the new rhythm. Officers who had once acted with mechanical precision now moved with care, considering every gesture, every word, and every pause. The outward semblance of calm persisted, yet internally, attention heightened, focus sharpened, and anticipation lingered longer than before. Each subtle deviation observed in others became a soft lesson, a quiet reminder that control was no longer absolute. The pulse of the system, once smooth and continuous, now carried intermittent tremors, gentle but perceptible to those who listened closely. Reflection became necessary, almost inevitable, threading through thought, like a gentle current beneath visible calm. Even silence, the previously unshakable tool of authority, now felt partially unstable, echoing with latent tension. Officers moved with careful rhythm, balancing observation, anticipation, and self-awareness in quiet harmony. And as the tide of external events pressed inward, the architecture of influence shifted imperceptibly, yet persistently. The rhythm of power, once confident, now oscillated with subtle uncertainty, carrying the story forward. The change in momentum was slow but persistent, threading through offices, homes, and city streets alike. Even in spaces of routine, subtle signals of disruption appeared, soft and persistent, altering the cadence of interaction. Officers observed with heightened sensitivity, noting gestures, glances, and hesitations that once would have gone unnoticed. The landscape of expectation now seemed mutable, softly rearranged by forces beyond immediate control. The pulse of fear, long wielded outward, returned gently inward, shaping awareness and perception quietly, insistently. Even habitual routines, once predictable and comforting, carried the undercurrent of uncertainty, shifting rhythm without overt recognition. Reflection, attention, and anticipation intertwined, creating a soft oscillation in thought, gesture, and expectation. The tide of war, slow and hypnotic, moved quietly yet inexorably, reshaping behavior and rhythm alike. And in this gentle but pervasive shift, the narrative advanced, threading the story of reversal with patience and subtlety. The turning tide carried awareness, caution, and reflection forward, calm but undeniable. As external pressure increased, internal awareness deepened further, threading a subtle tension through thought and gesture. Officers became observers of themselves, noting hesitation, recalibration, and instinctive caution with quiet attention. The rhythm of control wavered gently, as if the familiar currents of influence had met resistance, soft enough to be measured, yet persistent enough to alter motion. Even silence, the once unbroken tool of subtle mastery, now carried whispers of change, reflecting a new reality that demanded patience and care. Every small act, pause, or choice became a note in this slowly evolving rhythm, measured and deliberate. Reflection, previously optional, became persistent, threading softly through observation, expectation, and instinct. The turning tide moved steadily, carrying awareness and adaptation, anticipation, and subtle anxiety, all interwoven within a calm exterior. Officers adjusted to the new cadence, conscious of its fragility, and yet able to move within it with careful attention. And through these gentle shifts, the narrative flowed onward, measured and hypnotically continuous. The story of the hunter, now touched by the current of reversal, drifted softly into reflection and transformation. The rhythm of influence, once assured, now met soft but steady resistance. Citizens and observers, once quietly guided by expectation, began to act in ways that subtly defied prediction. Even minor deviations carried amplified significance, resonating softly through the architecture of control. Officers navigated the new patterns with careful attention, calibrating observation, anticipation, and reflection to accommodate gentle disruption. The pulse of authority persisted outwardly, yet inwardly, awareness and uncertainty intertwined, shaping thought and action delicately. The tides of war and consequence moved imperceptibly yet persistently, threading through streets, offices, and homes with quiet effect. Even habitual gestures now carried reflection, the mind balancing instinct, attention, and the soft pressure of altered circumstances. And in this oscillation between anticipation and caution, the story of shifting power advanced, slow, calm, and hypnotically compelling. The turning tide carried forward not only observation, but the quiet pulse of consequence, threading each moment gently into the next. The momentum of reversal, though subtle, became undeniable over time. Officers sensed the shifting rhythm of influence in each interaction, each hesitation, and each unspoken cue. Even spaces once defined by control and predictability now carried gentle uncertainty, a soft pulse threading through routine. The outward appearance of calm persisted, but within, awareness, caution, and reflection had softened the edges of confidence. Each moment became a delicate negotiation between instinct, observation, and anticipation, threading softly through consciousness and gesture alike. The rhythm of fear, once projected outward, now folded inward, shaping thought and perception quietly yet persistently. And in this slow, measured reversal, the story of the hunter became entwined with reflection, accountability, and the soft inevitability of change. The tide of events moved forward, hypnotic, calm, and pervasive, carrying the narrative gently to the next chapter of quiet reckoning. The final days arrived gently, almost imperceptibly, yet with a quiet inevitability that touched every office, street, and home. Papers that had once structured observation and control were gathered slowly, their edges curling under the warmth of flames, whispering softly as they vanished into smoke. The echo of meticulous record-keeping lingered faintly in empty rooms, a quiet testament to a system that had measured lives with unwavering precision. Guards and officers moved through corridors with subdued urgency, their steps careful, deliberate, and unusually reflective. Even as the work of destruction proceeded, there was a rhythm to it, a soft, measured cadence that seemed to honor what once was. Prisoners had long departed, leaving silence to settle like a gentle fog through empty halls and abandoned offices. And yet, even in absence, traces remained, small hints, a flicker of memory, a soft imprint that could not be fully erased. The act of vanishing was deliberate, slow, and reflective, carrying with it the weight of years of quiet authority. Each flicker of flame transformed knowledge into ephemeral smoke, yet the essence lingered in memory, soft and unbroken. And through this deliberate dissolution, the narrative drifted gently toward reflection, absence, and memory. The emptiness of the halls brought with it a gentle stillness, soft as a sigh. Doors once closed with authority now hung ajar, revealing the faint scent of paper, ink, and the lingering trace of human presence. The machinery of observation, once humming quietly in the background, lay dormant, its rhythm replaced by quiet echo. Officers paused, noticing how silence previously wielded outward, now settled inward, a soft reflection of absence and inevitability. Each file burned, carried with it the soft weight of lives, the delicate imprint of routine, and the gentle pulse of memory that refused to disappear entirely. Even as evidence was consumed, the act was slow, deliberate, and almost reverent, a subtle acknowledgement of what had been lost and measured. The rhythm of control, once pervasive, had dissipated into whispering smoke, leaving only suggestion and shadow in its wake. And in this gentle vanishing, the quiet persistence of truth remained, threading softly through absence, reflection, and memory. Each moment was a meditation on transience, carrying the listener gently toward the next stage of remembrance. Through this calm dissolution, the story moved onward, slow, hypnotic, and enduring. The streets outside echoed differently, empty yet full with faint traces of what had passed. Windows once watched closely, now reflected only sky and subtle movement, carrying the whisper of vanished oversight. Citizens, long guided by rhythm and expectation, moved slowly, as if adjusting instinctively to the sudden absence of attention. The pulse of fear that had shaped daily life now dissolved into a soft fog, leaving quiet contemplation in its place. Officers, once precise and methodical, felt the weight of reflection pressing gently upon them, threading softly through posture, gesture, and thought. The buildings themselves seemed to sigh, as if releasing years of silent observation and the careful architecture of influence. Even in retreat, the system retained its rhythm, faintly, softly, like a heartbeat gradually slowing. Each movement, each pause carried with it memory, reflection, and anticipation, threading slowly into the quiet. And as the machinery of fear disappeared, the essence of its work lingered, subtle and unbroken in the echoes of thought. The vanishing unfolded like a gentle tide, retreating softly, yet leaving its trace. As flames consumed documents, the air shimmered gently with heat and memory, carrying the scent of paper, ink, and faint smoke. Each burning file was a soft, transient act, leaving behind ash that hinted at what had once been. Even as the work proceeded methodically, there was a rhythm to destruction, slow and deliberate, almost meditative. Officers moved with quiet deliberation, conscious of both action and absence, threading reflection through routine. The pulse of silence, once applied outward, now settled inward, pressing softly upon conscience and memory. Prison corridors, once filled with anticipation and observation, echoed faintly, carrying the gentle imprint of those who had passed through. Even the smallest remaining details, a misplaced paper, a lingering scent, seemed to speak softly, testifying to persistence beyond deliberate erasure. Each flame transformed knowledge into smoke, yet memory retained subtle patterns, soft and enduring. The process was calm, hypnotic, and quiet, yet the resonance of action remained faintly perceptible, and through this measured dissolution, the narrative moved onward, threading gently toward quiet remembrance. The act of vanishing was not sudden, but cumulative, each gesture, each flame, each absence, adding to a slow, inevitable transformation. Offices emptied their contents carefully, shelves stripped, drawers cleared, files consumed. The rhythm of method persisted, soft, slow, deliberate, echoing the same quiet care that had structured years of work. Even as authority disappeared from corridors, its memory remained, subtle and unbroken, threading through the minds of those who had operated within it. Officers reflected gently, tracing the paths of decisions, observation, and influence, considering the ephemeral nature of their work. Each action was quiet, respectful of both what had been and what was being erased, carried out with measured patience. The absence of oversight brought new awareness, a soft reflection of the system's reach and its limits. Even as the machinery of control disappeared, the rhythm of memory persisted, subtle, soft, and enduring. And in this quiet act of vanishing, the story of influence and fear threaded onward, soft as smoke, gentle as ash, and hypnotically continuous. The narrative continued, calm yet charged with quiet reflection. The process revealed not just the erasure of documents, but the vanishing of certainty, rhythm, and expectation. Officers moved through spaces once filled with rhythm and control, now echoing with quiet absence. The pulse of fear once outwardly imposed had retreated into memory, leaving reflection to settle gently like morning mist. Each file burned, each empty corridor, and each silent office carried the soft weight of history, preserved faintly in memory, even as physical traces disappeared. The rhythm of previous authority lingered in gestures, pauses, and thought, faintly echoing through quiet corridors and empty rooms. Citizens adapted slowly, unconsciously sensing the dissolution of oversight, moving through streets and homes with soft awareness of altered rhythms. Reflection persisted, threading through thought like a slow current, carrying understanding, memory, and quiet awareness forward. Even as the system vanished, the essence of observation and influence remained subtly unspoken and unbroken, and in this gentle retreat, the narrative drifted toward memory, quiet testimony, and the next chapter of reckoning. The vanishing moved forward softly, hypnotic, calm, and enduring. Even in absence, the rhythm of influence persisted, like a faint heartbeat in empty corridors. Officers carried awareness inward, noticing the softness of each gesture, the subtle weight of conscience, and the gentle imprint of past authority. Silence, once a tool, now became reflection, threading softly through thought and memory alike. Each space, cleared and quiet, held traces of action and observation, subtle yet insistent, speaking softly to those who paused to listen. The act of destruction was methodical, yet hypnotically calm, each flame a quiet punctuation to years of careful observation. Even the ashes whispered softly, carrying echoes of documentation, routine and attention, faintly perceptible to those attuned to rhythm. Officers reflected gently on the impermanence of their work, tracing the arc of influence from inception to quiet disappearance. And as the vanishing continued, the narrative moved forward softly, threading memory, reflection, and subtle awareness into the calm air. The silence persisted, carrying forward the faint heartbeat of what had been slow, hypnotic, and unbroken. In the final hours, as corridors emptied and offices were stripped, a sense of gentle closure settled. The system that had guided lives with rhythm and quiet precision now existed only in memory, whispering through the minds of those who had participated in its unfolding. Each flame, each cleared shelf, each empty desk was a soft punctuation in the story of human control and observation. Even in its absence, the system's pulse lingered faintly, threading through reflection, thought, and memory alike. Officers moved quietly, contemplating the ephemeral nature of authority, observation, and influence. The rhythm of fear, once pervasive, dissolved into quiet reflection, leaving a calm yet hypnotic presence in its wake. Every detail of vanished control remained softly imprinted in the consciousness of those who remembered. And as the last embers faded, the narrative drifted gently forward, threading quiet understanding, memory, and reflection toward the final moments of reckoning. The vanishing was complete, yet its essence remained, subtle, soft, and enduring. And through this gentle absence, the story continued, hypnotic, calm, and unbroken. The war had passed, yet its quiet reverberations lingered in the air like mist through empty streets. Survivors walked softly, carrying memories folded carefully within, each step measured against a rhythm of recollection and restraint. Buildings stripped of purpose reflected only fragments of what had been, their silent walls holding faint traces of footsteps, whispers, and observation. Even the wind seemed to carry a soft resonance, threading through empty corridors and shattered windows with gentle insistence. In quiet rooms, memories surfaced slowly, like water rising to meet a hesitant dawn, bringing with them the weight of absence and the texture of experience. Testimonies once silenced began to form, soft and measured, emerging from mouths that trembled with reflection rather than anger. Both victims and perpetrators spoke cautiously, their voices careful, carrying the weight of years steeped in quiet observation and methodical control. The echo of routine lingered faintly, as if the very air remembered the rhythm of fear and obedience. And through this calm unfolding, the story moved forward gently, threading reflection, memory, and the subtle persistence of humanity. The ruins themselves seemed to whisper softly, carrying the narrative toward the next stage of remembrance. Streets once filled with tension now breathed quietly, carrying the soft weight of history. Each corner, each abandoned office, seemed to hold a faint echo of rhythm, now broken, now soft, now measured only by the slow passage of reflection. Survivors paused, sensing the quiet traces left by both watchful eyes and careful hands, and wondered how absence could speak so clearly. Memories unfolded in layers, gentle yet persistent, revealing not only what had been endured, but also what had been observed, recorded, and remembered. Even silence, long a tool of control, now carried with it a new meaning, threaded through memory and reflection rather than obedience. Conversations emerged slowly, soft as the fall of ash, threading carefully through the spaces once filled with rhythm and anticipation. The weight of accumulated observation lingered, subtle, like a shadow that refused to vanish entirely, shaping thought and posture in quiet, deliberate ways. In this calm landscape, even the faintest recollection held significance, weaving human memory with the soft pulse of reflection. And as stories surfaced gently, they carried with them the echo of past rhythm, slow, hypnotic, and enduring. Through this patient emergence, the narrative drifted forward, threading memory, conscience, and understanding. Rooms once filled with meticulous record-keeping now lay silent, their papers gone, their shelves bare, yet memory retained subtle patterns. Each empty desk carried the quiet imprint of hands, thought, and intent, lingering like soft footprints in dust. Survivors and witnesses moved slowly through these spaces, tracing faint impressions left by those who had passed before them. Even the air seemed dense with recollection, carrying whispers of voices once silent, gestures once precise, and rhythms once exact. Reflection, gentle and persistent, threaded through the ruins, as those who remembered pieced together the cadence of control, observation, and influence. Memory carried with it both clarity and uncertainty, blending the factual with the emotional in subtle, hypnotic ways. Testimonies emerged softly, revealing the texture of daily life under observation, the quiet pressure of expectation, and the human moments threaded through routine. Each narrative unfolded with calm attention, carrying listener and survivor alike through the gentle pulse of recollection. And through these emergent stories, the past spoke quietly, yet with enduring resonance. The ruins, though silent, held the heartbeat of memory, subtle, hypnotic, and persistent. Even as the years passed, the echoes of rhythm and observation remained, faint yet persistent. Survivors found themselves recalling gestures, pauses, and subtle signals as though the memory had taken root in posture and instinct. The soft pulse of routine lingered in thought, threading through reflection and shaping quiet understanding. Conversations, shared in whispers or measured tones, carried the weight of careful consideration, threading gently through communities that had once lived under observation. Memory, tempered by the slow rhythm of time, transformed experience into insight, carrying awareness into calm reflection. Even those who had wielded power quietly reconsidered their own histories, threading conscience through memory with subtle attention. The city itself, in gentle recovery, seemed to breathe with an altered rhythm, its silent architecture echoing the soft persistence of past lives and quiet presence. And in this slow unfolding, the narrative drifted softly, threading experience, reflection, and enduring observation into a gentle hypnotic flow. The remnants of control, though vanished, continued to speak softly through memory and thought. Through these echoes the story moved onward, calm, measured, and unbroken. Testimonies gathered in small groups, in quiet rooms, or alongside gentle rivers, carrying fragments of experience, like soft petals on the wind. Each voice, measured and deliberate, conveyed rhythm and tension without urgency, revealing the texture of life, shaped by invisible currents of control. Even the faintest recollection held weight, threading memory through thought in hypnotic, unbroken patterns. Survivors spoke not to condemn but to recount, to release memory into language, soft and deliberate as breath. The cadence of their words mirrored the rhythm of observation once imposed, now transformed into reflection and gentle insight. Silence once pervasive had shifted into listening, allowing attention to settle upon details that had long gone unspoken. Each story became a bridge, connecting human memory to the architecture of lived experience, threading the past with present awareness. The gentle surfacing of truth carried persistence, soft as fog, yet distinct in its presence, slow and enduring. And through these narratives, the ruins whispered quietly, threading history into memory, thought and reflection. The echoes, soft yet persistent, carried the listener toward calm understanding. The human mind, shaped by years of rhythm and observation, now carried memory softly forward, threading reflection through daily awareness. Survivors noticed how instinct still recalled gestures, pauses, and soft signals once memorized under expectation. Even small details, a faint sound, a particular scent, could evoke the gentle cadence of previous experience. Memory itself became a rhythm, measured, hypnotic, and persistent, linking past to present without haste or urgency. Conversations unfolded slowly, threading insight, recollection, and quiet understanding into shared space. The ruins remained silent but full of traces, echoing both the fragility and endurance of human awareness. Even those who had observed, controlled, and measured now reflected quietly on their own histories, threading conscience through memory with subtle care. Each soft recollection carried with it the rhythm of years, threading individual experience into a shared hypnotic cadence. And through this gentle process, understanding emerged slowly, softly, and calmly, guiding the listener toward quiet reflection. The echoes in the ruins persisted, subtle, enduring, and hypnotically serene. The passage of time softened the edges of memory, yet left the rhythm intact, subtle and persistent. Survivors and witnesses carried both clarity and uncertainty, threading experience into reflection with gentle care. The soft cadence of remembrance continued through conversations, diaries, and silent contemplation, weaving thought with memory in hypnotic patterns. Even the air, stirred gently by wind or human presence, seemed to carry whispers of past observation, lingering faintly over stone, brick, and empty floors. The pulse of history, quiet and deliberate, threaded slowly through minds and spaces, connecting events, gestures, and reflections in gentle continuity. Testimonies, emerging carefully, carried rhythm and texture, narrating both absence and presence with measured precision. The ruins, though stripped of function, retained soft memory in walls, floors, and door frames, echoing subtle impressions like long-forgotten music. Reflection threaded through each story, gentle as a sigh, persistent as breath, carrying understanding forward without urgency. And through these soft currents, the narrative flowed slowly, hypnotically, and calmly, linking past, memory, and presence in a serene continuum. The echoes in the ruins persisted, gentle, enduring, and unbroken. Even in the quiet of long shadows, memory continued to speak softly, threading experience into gentle understanding. Survivors walked slowly, attentive to the rhythm of thought, the pulse of recollection, and the gentle layering of awareness. Each sound, each movement, each moment of quiet carried traces of previous patterns, soft as fog, yet persistent as breath. Conversations emerged carefully, measured with attention, weaving threads of insight through reflection and memory alike. The past, though vanished in files and offices, persisted subtly in posture, instinct, and thought, threading outward with calm resonance. Even silence now held meaning, carrying weight and rhythm, persistent yet soft, hypnotic yet delicate. The story of human experience moved forward slowly, threading memory, reflection, and insight into the quiet fabric of post-war life. Testimonies, faint but persistent, became bridges linking absence to awareness, rhythm to understanding, and past to present. And through this gentle emergence, the narrative drifted onward, slow, calm, and hypnotic, carrying echoes softly through ruins and thought alike. The past spoke in whispers, enduring, subtle, and serene. Through quiet spaces, softened memory, and gentle reflection, the narrative of the Gestapo's rhythm persisted in subtle form. Survivors, witnesses, and even former participants carried fragments forward, threading insight, awareness, and human presence into the landscape of post-war life. The ruins, silent and still, breathed softly with accumulated memory, carrying subtle echoes of observation, influence, and reflection. Time, calm and measured, allowed the past to settle gently into the present, threading hypnotic continuity through thought and awareness. Each recollection, each whisper, each quiet step through space became a note in this enduring rhythm, soft yet persistent, gentle yet meaningful. Even as the machinery of control vanished, its essence lingered in human memory, subtle, enduring, and hypnotically serene. And through this soft persistence, the story of observation, reflection, and memory moved forward, threading calm awareness through space, thought, and time. The echoes in the ruins continued, subtle, soft, and enduring, carrying the listener gently toward the next chapter of understanding. Even after the Reich had crumbled, the quiet patterns of control persisted, threading gently through new landscapes and circumstances. Intelligence agencies in distant capitals observed, measured, and whispered, carrying forward lessons learned in corridors long emptied of authority. Fear, subtle and persistent, became a language understood beyond borders, a rhythm of suggestion that moved softly yet insistently through human systems. Former interrogators, quietly dispersed, carried methods in memory, their gestures, pauses, and words forming the soft pulse of enduring influence. Practices of observation and subtle manipulation reappeared in new uniforms, in new offices, and in distant archives, their presence faint but undeniable. Even as nations rebuilt, the architecture of attention and compliance echoed quietly, threading psychological mastery into emerging structures of power. Citizens, unaware of the rhythm beneath, adjusted instinctively to pressure, suggestion, and expectation, carrying forward habits once imposed decades before. And in this persistence, the whisper of fear moved gently through time, subtle as a tide, hypnotic and enduring. Each method, adapted and reformed, retained the essence of observation and control, threading softly into human behavior. Through this quiet continuation, the narrative flowed onward, echoing past influence into the present. The principles of the past became lessons in anticipation, suggestion, and subtle observation, carried into new institutions that valued efficiency as much as compliance. Those who remembered the rhythm applied it quietly, without spectacle, embedding influence in systems rather than bodies. Fear no longer needed immediacy to persist. It became structural, woven into routine, expectation, and the invisible architecture of authority. Even whispers, soft and measured, could carry influence across rooms, streets, and nations, threading human behavior through subtle attention and reflection. The echo of control persisted in gestures, silence, and suggestion, teaching new generations a rhythm of compliance, unspoken yet felt. Observers learned to measure hesitation, to notice small signs, and to allow perception to act as enforcement, soft as a shadow yet persistent as memory. Citizens adjusted, often unknowingly, to invisible rhythms that guided thought, posture, and speech, the pulse of influence threading through society with hypnotic subtlety. And through these delicate, quiet mechanisms, the language of fear endured, reshaped, yet hauntingly familiar. The lessons of the past were distilled into practice, calm yet potent, soft yet insistent. Each echo of methodology carried forward the memory of patterns learned long ago, threading quietly into the present. Memory, both collective and personal, served as a repository for these rhythms, preserving subtle influence through time. Stories passed in quiet conversation retained the soft cadence of control, whispering lessons without ever naming them. Former agents, scholars, and witnesses carried fragments of methodology into new roles, where the same structures of anticipation and obedience could take root under different names. Even distance could not dissolve the faint patterns of authority. They adapted, folded into the architecture of bureaucracy, embedded into routine observation and measured response. Each gesture, each pause, each hint of pressure was a soft repetition of lessons learned long before, a quiet echo threading into modern practice. The essence of control moved gently through institutions, whispering through corridors, files, and meetings, subtle yet persistent, like a memory refusing to fade. Citizens unaware of the invisible rhythm navigated space with learned caution, a soft testament to the endurance of influence. And through this calm persistence, the language of fear became not just historical, but timeless, threading softly through minds and systems alike. Each whisper, each subtle measure of compliance, reinforced patterns of quiet observation, persistent as a tide. Through this hypnotic continuity, the past touched the present with soft insistence, carrying forward understanding, reflection, and caution. Even distant societies observed the subtle pulse of psychological mastery, recognizing its quiet effectiveness and adopting its principles with gentle adaptation. Subtlety replaced spectacle, rhythm replaced overt coercion, and observation replaced immediate threat, threading influence into calm, unremarkable routines. Individuals, often unaware, felt the gentle pressure of expectation and authority, adjusting behavior without conscious recognition, their compliance soft as breath, yet insistent as tide. Methods evolved, leaving the overt brutality behind, yet retaining the essential architecture of attention, anticipation, and psychological rhythm. Small gestures, pauses, and the cadence of conversation became instruments of influence, subtle yet enduring, threading human behavior into new patterns. Even whispers exchanged carefully carried the weight of suggestion, shaping thought and behavior in soft, deliberate ways. The echo of prior methods persisted, threaded through observation, reflection, and subtle manipulation, quiet yet unmistakable. And in this persistence, the language of fear became more enduring, diffused and hypnotic, influencing beyond the borders of memory or history. Each quiet adaptation preserved the rhythm of control, threading through minds and institutions like slow, imperceptible currents. Through this enduring influence, the story of subtle mastery carried forward, calm, hypnotic, and persistent. The haunting continuity of influence revealed itself in the soft persistence of structure and expectation, threading through systems across continents, intelligence operations, administrative oversight, and covert observation all carried forward traces of techniques once perfected decades before. Subtlety was key, the quiet art of influence replacing overt assertion, threading human behavior through observation, suggestion, and anticipation. Citizens, employees, and participants moved instinctively within these systems, aware or unaware of the rhythm, adjusting posture, voice, and thought with quiet reflection. Former practitioners carried memories as soft instruments, shaping policy, procedure, and interaction with a gentle, hypnotic precision. Even the absence of overt threat carried weight, as memory and expectation enforced the rhythm of behavior quietly and persistently. The pulse of psychological influence, refined and adapted, became a soft undercurrent beneath society, threading subtly through daily life. And in this calm, persistent hum, the lessons of the past were reborn, quiet yet insistent, subtle yet enduring. Each adaptation preserved the essence of influence, whispering in corridors, offices, and private rooms alike. Through this hypnotic echo, the narrative traced the enduring continuity of control, soft, reflective, and persistent. Even as decades passed, the patterns of influence whispered through institutions, shaping minds and behavior with gentle insistence. Small signals, gestures, and pauses carried weight, threading expectation and suggestion into the daily rhythm of life. Observation, subtle and persistent, replaced the immediacy of overt authority, yet retained the same hypnotic power. Citizens, employees, and observers responded unconsciously, carrying forward lessons learned through quiet influence, reflection, and subtle pressure. The rhythm of psychological control endured, soft as breath, yet persistent as tide, threading humanity through networks of unseen attention. Even memory served as a vessel, carrying fragments of method and insight into successive generations, both within and outside formal structures. Lessons once wielded with precision persisted as soft rhythms in interaction, subtle patterns that guided behavior without fanfare. And in these quiet echoes, the language of fear continued to shape thought, influence decision, and condition expectation. Each subtle measure reinforced understanding, threading past and present into a continuous hypnotic flow. Through this enduring cadence, the story of influence moved forward calmly, softly, and unbroken. Observation, suggestion, and subtle expectation became the quiet lingua franca of authority, threading influence beyond borders and time. Methods adapted, shedding brutality, keeping only the essence of rhythm, pause, and psychological nuance. Citizens and practitioners alike learned, often unconsciously, to navigate subtle pressures, threading their behavior through invisible architectures of expectation. Former instructors, witnesses, and participants carried the methods forward, shaping practice, policy, and reflection with soft, deliberate attention. Even silence carried weight, a gentle reminder of observation and the persistence of influence across space and time. Patterns repeated in offices, institutions, and communities retained hypnotic effectiveness, quiet yet unmistakable, threading past into present. And through this enduring practice, the subtle language of fear persisted, adapted to new contexts yet hauntingly familiar. Each gesture, pause, and measured expectation preserved the soft pulse of control, hypnotic, persistent, and calm. Memory and method intertwined, creating a quiet continuum that whispered softly through the corridors of time. Through this subtle reflective persistence, the narrative carried forward, threading past, present, and human awareness into a gentle, enduring rhythm. The legacy of subtle influence persisted in quiet, pervasive ways, threading expectation through culture, bureaucracy, and human interaction. Psychological mastery, once learned under the shadow of overt authority, now operated invisibly, threading through society with calm persistence. Citizens, unaware, adapted instinctively, carrying forward rhythms of compliance and observation inherited through subtle influence. Institutions, offices, and routines retained soft echoes of prior methodology, shaping thought, response, and behavior with quiet precision. Observation and expectation, interwoven with subtle suggestion, formed a hypnotic pattern that endured beyond generations and borders. Even in the absence of overt threat, the pulse of control persisted, a soft undercurrent threading through daily life and human interaction. And in this quiet, persistent rhythm, the language of fear endured, gentle, hypnotic, and unbroken, whispering lessons of influence softly into the present. Memory, reflection, and subtle awareness carried forward what was learned, threading past into modern practice with calm, enduring precision. Each echo reinforced understanding, weaving continuity between history and lived experience. Subtle yet insistent. Through this calm persistence, the narrative flowed onward, reflective, hypnotic, and enduring, toward the final chapter of quiet reckoning. Even as the world changed, the echo of methods persisted quietly, threading understanding and influence through time. Subtle rhythms of observation, expectation, and psychological guidance endured in whispers, gestures, and measured pauses, soft yet unmistakable. Citizens and agents alike moved within these patterns, adjusting behavior with instinctive care, threading memory and influence into daily life. The language of fear, though transformed, remained hypnotically effective, carrying lessons learned decades before into new contexts and environments. Patterns once explicit now operated invisibly, threading human thought, action, and reflection with calm persistence. Memory, testimony, and method merged, carrying subtle, enduring influence forward with gentle insistence. And in this quiet, reflective rhythm, the continuity of psychological mastery became clear, soft as breath yet persistent as tide, threading past, present, and human awareness together. Each adaptation preserved essential lessons, subtle yet hypnotic, shaping interaction, perception, and expectation. Through these quiet echoes, the narrative continued, calm, soft, and enduring, threading influence gently into the world. And through this soft, persistent pulse, the story of control moved toward its final chapter, serene, reflective, and unbroken. The streets of present-day Germany carry a calm that feels almost deliberate, a soft exhalation after years of weighty memory. Museums now occupy buildings that once housed quiet offices of authority, their walls empty yet heavy with reflection. Visitors move slowly through corridors where echoes of past routine linger, subtle and hypnotic, threading memory into the soft rhythm of present awareness. Each room holds traces, not of action but of attention. The meticulous order, the careful silence, the pause between observation and expectation. Sunlight falls through high windows, spilling across empty floors, touching surfaces that once carried the weight of human observation. Even air seems thicker here, imbued with recollection, carrying whispers of long-past gestures and long-faded rhythm. Guides speak softly, their words measured, allowing silence to fill the spaces between, threading reflection gently into the mind. Memory, restrained yet persistent, floats through these rooms like a quiet river, shaping understanding with calm insistence. And through the gentle movement of visitors and thought, the past begins to converse softly with the present, lingering yet unobtrusive. Beneath the quiet sky, the narrative threads toward reflection, soft and persistent. Every desk, every empty filing cabinet, carries a subtle imprint of presence, a rhythm of hands that moved carefully, systematically, and deliberately. Notes, charts, and ledgers once filled these spaces, their patterns of thought now transformed into artifacts of reflection. Silence pervades, not as absence, but as a gentle companion, allowing memory to breathe slowly into consciousness. Visitors notice the faint pulse of past rhythm in the alignment of furniture, the geometry of rooms, and the muted light that softens edges. Even the smallest detail evokes contemplation, the tilt of a chair, the polish of a floor, the lingering scent of paper and wood. Time has softened the harsh edges of history, leaving behind texture rather than terror, allowing understanding to emerge calmly and deliberately. And in this careful unfolding, one senses the persistence of human awareness, of choices remembered, of lessons distilled through reflection. The air hums softly with the weight of responsibility, a rhythm unspoken yet deeply felt, threading thought into perception. Each step through the museum carries the mind gently forward toward meditation on memory, action, and consequence. The walls, silent yet insistent, invite reflection beneath the calm sky. Outside, the city moves quietly, rhythms of daily life brushing softly against history's shadow. Streets are filled with ordinary sounds, footsteps, conversation, the distant hum of traffic. Yet each echoes faintly against layers of memory embedded in brick and stone. Even the architecture, modern and historical, carries subtle hints of rhythm, order, and attention, whispering lessons of observation into everyday life. People pass unknowingly through spaces where past authority once held sway, their movements unconsciously shaped by patterns left long ago. Shadows of routine linger in unexpected corners, threading awareness into perception, gentle and hypnotic, like a soft pulse beneath consciousness. The mind, aware or not, carries memory forward, blending reflection with movement, observation with participation. Silence remains pervasive yet gentle, a quiet vessel holding both remembrance and calm insight. And in the ebb and flow of daily life, the past converses softly with the present, its voice subtle, persistent, and reflective. Even fleeting awareness carries the imprint of history, quiet, unhurried, and deeply human. Beneath the quiet sky, the rhythm of memory threads through time, patient, calm, and enduring. Inside the museums, photographs, letters, and artifacts speak softly, inviting reflection without demand. Each piece, carefully preserved, threads memory into perception, layering insight upon quiet awareness. Visitors linger reading, pausing, listening, their breath measured as they encounter echoes of routine, choice, and consequence. The rooms are hushed, yet full of a subtle life, carried in memory and reflection rather than activity. Even light seems to move deliberately here, tracing walls, floors, and objects with a soft, hypnotic cadence. Time stretches and folds gently in these spaces, blending the past and present into a seamless rhythm of awareness. The faint scent of aged paper and polished wood threads through the air, carrying traces of past attention into the stillness of now. And as one moves slowly through these rooms, reflection deepens, drawing the mind into gentle contemplation of history, responsibility, and continuity. Every artifact becomes a note in a quiet melody, threading insight softly into consciousness. Beneath the quiet sky, these notes resonate, carrying forward the lessons of memory with calm insistence. Even gardens and courtyards, once sites of casual movement or waiting, now breathe with quiet reflection. Trees sway softly, leaves rustling like whispers, carrying the pulse of years past into gentle perception. Paths once trodden with anticipation or fear now guide calm exploration, threading memory into space without urgency. Visitors sit on benches, letting observation and reflection unfold slowly, carrying history in gentle rhythm through mind and body. Birds, indifferent to human remembrance, move freely, yet their presence mirrors the quiet persistence of life, threading vitality into spaces shaped by reflection and attention. Each soft sound, each subtle movement, threads awareness gently forward, reminding the mind of continuity, consequence, and calm understanding. Even shadows, lengthening with the sun, participate in the slow meditation, connecting space, light, and memory with hypnotic ease. And in this stillness, the past converses softly with present perception, guiding insight, reflection, and understanding without urgency. Time here carries both memory and calm, weaving them together like a slow, deliberate melody. Beneath the quiet sky, history hums softly, subtle, enduring, and hypnotic. The stories of individuals, once silent, now surface quietly in these spaces, carrying rhythm and experience gently forward. Letters, diaries, and recordings allow voices to speak softly across decades, threading memory into perception, reflection, and understanding. Visitors read, listen, and absorb these echoes with measured attention, each note unfolding slowly, hypnotically into thought. Even the absence of overt presence is meaningful, as silence becomes a canvas for reflection, a space for memory to breathe. The human pulse in both story and observer threads rhythmically through the quiet, soft yet insistent. Insight emerges in gentle waves, carried on breath, movement, and thought, threading history into consciousness without urgency. And as the past converses with the present in these spaces, the mind learns patience, reflection, and careful attention. The subtle persistence of memory and understanding becomes a hypnotic rhythm, slow and deliberate, threading awareness through time. Each story, soft yet potent, becomes part of the landscape, weaving presence, memory, and reflection into a calm continuum. Beneath the quiet sky, every story resonates, persistent, gentle, and enduring. Even hallways empty of artifacts carry soft resonance, shaped by the rhythm of countless footsteps long gone. Walls, floors, and ceilings seem to hum faintly with the memory of attention, observation, and quiet control. Each echo threads subtly into the present, guiding thought, reflection, and awareness with hypnotic patience. Visitors sense the pulse of history, soft and deliberate, yet insistent in its quiet presence. Silence, gentle and pervasive, becomes a companion to reflection, holding space for memory, conscience and meditation. Light moves slowly across surfaces, accentuating textures, shadows, and faint traces of past rhythm. The mind, carried gently forward by this calm environment, engages with history not as spectacle, but as subtle insight. And in these quiet corridors, memory persists, hypnotic, reflective, and enduring, threading understanding into perception without demand. Each step, soft and deliberate, moves the observer through time, space, and awareness, carrying reflection forward slowly. Beneath the quiet sky, every footstep resonates softly, echoing memory, thought, and human presence. Even outside, in the stillness of streets, parks, and squares, the lessons of observation and quiet reflection endure. Pedestrians move unconsciously through spaces once dense with attention, their gestures and pauses threaded by rhythms learned long ago. Buildings, old and new, hum softly with memory, carrying traces of past focus into calm awareness. The rhythm of life persists, subtle yet insistent, threading human thought, presence, and reflection into a hypnotic flow. Wind carries whispers through leaves and stone, threading perception with gentle insistence, soft as breath yet persistent as time. Memory, present yet distant, informs awareness, shaping understanding, attention, and reflection with quiet precision. Even in the absence of deliberate observation, the pulse of history threads gently through space, human perception, and thought alike. And as the day moves softly into evening, the world holds a measured breath, threading past and present into a serene continuum. Beneath the quiet sky, reflection and memory flow gently, hypnotic, persistent, and calm. And in this gentle, enduring rhythm, the walls no longer whisper, but they remember every sound we choose to forget.